Ron Black, Ronnie, to his friends and family, studied the chart in front of him, but his mind wasn't on work. It was about what he had been told earlier that day about Nancy, his wife of 2 years. He thought he had a good life and a beautiful, loving wife. But all this collapsed no more than 2 hours ago. "I'm sorry to tell you this, but your wife is cheating on you," Bill Jacobs told him while drinking beer at a bar near the pharmaceutical company where he worked as a researcher. Ron considered Bill more than just a colleague and a respected colleague. He considered him a friend. "How do you know?" asked Ron. Bill took a sip of his beer before continuing. "I heard some guys from the lab talking about it in the men's room," Bill said. "They bragged about taking her to the last company party." "Damn," said Ron. That explained a lot. The company liked to host regular parties for employees and their spouses in the newly built employee lounge, a huge room with a stage for an orchestra and a giant flat-screen monitor for showing movies. During normal working hours, it also served as a break room. The last meeting took place just 2 weeks ago. For 2 hours, Nancy was nowhere to be found. When she finally showed up, she stated that someone had given her a tour of the place. "I'm really sorry, man," Bill said. "I thought you should know." "Thanks, Bill," Ron said quietly. "You are a true friend." "You're welcome," Bill said. "I know if it were me, I would want to know. Just don't do anything stupid." Ron laughed at this. Stupidity was the last thing Ron could be accused of. Ignorant, maybe even a little naive about some things, but never stupid. "I won't," he told his friend. Bill finished his beer and put his hand on his friend's shoulder as he stood up. "If there's anything I can do, let me know," he said before leaving. Ron nodded his head and took another sip of his beer. As he thought about what Bill had said, he took stock of himself and thought about his life, replaying it in his mind like a movie. In almost every physical respect, Ron was below average. The youngest of 4 children, he was often ridiculed as the runt of the litter. At 5 feet 7 inches tall, he was about 2 inches shorter than the average man in the United States and weighed about 145 pounds. His body mass never fully developed, and as a result, he was physically weaker than most men his age and size. Add to this his generally gentle temperament, and it is easy to see why most people's first impression of him was that he was a weakling. He could count on one hand the number of times he had ever lost his temper, but even then, most of the time he just walked away. Throughout his life, his immediate family took advantage of his small stature, slight build, and calm manner. They seemed to enjoy laughing at him, calling him Little Ronnie, a name he despised. His 2 brothers, John and George, loved to tease and mock him. His sister Lisa, who was only a year older than him, often joined him, but was never as cruel as his older brothers. Even his parents bullied him and made him feel like less of a man. "Why can't you be like other boys?" his mother, June, asked when he refused to go out with his brothers. "Because I'm not like other boys," he said. "Why can't they be more like me? Why can't they try reading a book every now and then instead of throwing a ball all the time?" The only one in his family who didn't swear at him was his grandfather, Mark Black. He enjoyed visiting an elderly man who had the largest personal library he had ever seen. By the time Ron was 12, he had read every book in his grandfather's ever-growing library. His favorite story was Robert Louis Stevenson's 1886 classic, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. He was always amazed that people often got this story wrong. He also loved reading books about science and devoured everything he could find on the topic. While other children his age were struggling with Dick and Jane, he was reading War and Peace and treatises on biochemistry. His grandfather saw something in Ron that no one else saw and paid to have his IQ tested. When the score came back, he was amazed. With an IQ of 215, he surpassed Albert Einstein and Stephen Hawking. Ron was not just a genius, he fell into the category of immeasurable genius. With Ron's test results in hand, Mark paid for the young man to be tested for admission to Mensa, even though he was much younger than the minimum testing age. Mark and Ron celebrated with ice cream and cake when he was accepted into the organization. He, of course, was not the youngest of those accepted. but he was quite young. For the first time in his life, Ron felt happy. Mark encouraged the boy at every opportunity and even bought him the most powerful personal computer available on the market. Ron spent most of his free time on the internet, reading everything he could find. He thought it would be fun to learn other languages, so Mark bought software to help him. Soon Ron was fluent in several languages, including Russian, Greek, Spanish, and Latin. Just for fun, he learned Klingon, even though it wasn't actually a real language. Mark joined him, and they were soon speaking the language frequently, much to the chagrin of his family. "Dad, you're spoiling the boy," Ron's father, Bob, once told Mark. "He needs to learn something useful and not spend his whole life in these books of his." "The boy is gifted, Bob," Mark said. "Maybe if you spent as much time with him as you did with other kids, you would see it. Trust me, he goes anywhere, and I will do everything I can to help him." Of course, all this caused a lot of unpleasant moments at school. Like that time his teacher discussed Shakespeare. "Which line from Hamlet is your favorite?" she asked Ron one day in class. "Tapa Toberin" stated in perfect Klingon. Everyone looked at him in shock, thinking he had gone crazy. "What?" asked his teacher. "To be or not to be," said Ron. Or in the original Klingon language, live or die. "I see," said the teacher. After the lesson, the teacher detained him, and the other children left, giggling. She scolded him for the outburst and told him that if it ever happened again, he would be sent to the principal's office. "I'm really sorry," Ron said, looking at the floor. "What was that all about?" she asked. Ron pulled out a copy of Hamlet, translated into Klingon, and handed it to her. She smiled, looking at it. "Please try to stick to the original version, okay?" she asked. "I will," he said. Of course, Ron had already read the entire play, as well as several others written by the bard, as they were part of his grandfather's extensive library. Thanks to his photographic memory, he already remembered them all. If she had asked, he would probably have told her all this from memory. When he returned home after this incident, his parents scolded him and his brothers and sister teased him mercilessly. This was one of the few times Ron got angry. "Heglame kak jajvam," he hissed when they refused to stop. "What does it mean?" asked Lisa. He looked at her angrily. "Today is a good day to die," he said. Her eyes widened, and she slowly backed away from him. His brothers also backed away, wondering if their little brother was really crazy enough to put his words into action. They tried to stay away from him for the next few weeks. Mark continued to support Ron by purchasing him university-level textbooks in various subjects. Ron was particularly interested in chemistry and biology, thanks in part to Stevenson's novel, so Mark bought as many textbooks on these topics as possible. Watching his grandson, Mark realized that the boy was frankly bored at school. He passed every exam his teachers gave him, often without even preparing. Having connections in the school council, Mark arranged for Ron to take the Abitur exam. He believed it was time for the boy to face a new challenge. "Are you sure about this?" asked Dr. Williams, the local school superintendent. "Absolutely," Mark said. "The boy is extremely gifted, he has a very high IQ, and he is, frankly, bored. Heck, he could teach these classes. I want him to be in an environment that will challenge him." "Okay, Mark," Dr. Williams said. "Bring the boy and I'll do the test myself. If he does well enough, I'll help you get him into college." Mark was not surprised when he learned that Ron passed the exam with flying colors and did so in record time. "This is the most amazing thing I've ever seen," Dr. Williams said. "I gave him the hardest test I could, and look, not a single mistake. He even wrote a 3-page essay in the chemistry section." "It doesn't surprise me at all," Mark said. "Listen, I talked to the dean of admissions at MIT beforehand," Dr. Williams said. "If you don't mind, I'd like to try to get him there. This is a great school for both chemistry and biology." "Let's try it," Mark said. It took a while, but when the dean saw Ron's results, which included an IQ test, his participation in Mensa, and Dr. Williams' test, he made every effort to help Ron get into MIT. Ron and Mark were delighted, but his family was less than enthusiastic. "So you think you're better than all of us?" John asked as Ron gathered his things. Ron glanced at him. "No," he said. "Maybe a little smarter, but not better." "Well, yes, let's see what all this book wisdom will give you," John said with a mockery. George was more direct. "Remember, kid," said George, "retribution is an unpleasant thing. One day you will get what you deserve." Ron ignored him and continued getting ready. His parents refused to tell him anything and didn't even give him a goodbye hug. Lisa wasn't much better, but still hugged him. Ron left the house with his things and tears in his eyes when Mark came to pick him up. Mark's plan was to spend a few days driving Ron to school. "Why does my family hate me?" Ron asked Mark as the old man drove. "They don't hate you," Mark said. "They just don't understand you. I think you're reminding them of their own shortcomings." "What do you mean, Grandpa?" asked Ron. "You have a remarkable intellect, Ron," Mark said. "It scares them. This overwhelms them and makes them feel inadequate. Remember all those stories and books you read. I'm sure you can understand." "I guess so, Grandpa," said Ron. "I would still like to know that my family really loves me." "Well, I love you," Mark said, "and I'm damn proud of you. I know you will do great things one day." "Thanks, Grandpa," Ron said. "I love you too." So Ron became a student at MIT, even though he was too young to drive. He studied hard and read everything he could get his hands on, memorizing every last word. Most of the other students avoided him, but a few became good friends. Mark, who was quite wealthy, created a fund for Ron that paid for his education and all his expenses. He also arranged a monthly payment for Ron. Ron studied investing and put some of his knowledge into practice. As a result, he confidently moved towards creating a substantial capital for himself. When the time came, Ron used some of the money to buy himself a new car. Mark approved of Ron's initiative and gave him some advice that he had learned over the years. Ron did more than just study while at MIT. Influenced by Stevenson's writings, he began his own research project. Believing that science could solve all of humanity's problems, he wondered if it was possible to create something that would give physically weak people like himself an advantage without turning the patient into a killing machine or an uncontrollable monster on steroids. It was all just hypothetical at this stage, but it was an idea he never gave up. His online research led him to the work of Dr. Franklin Steiner, who has made significant advances in this field. According to Steiner's basic hypothesis, each of us has different defense mechanisms that help us cope with extreme situations. Sometimes we resort to another version of ourselves, what you could call an alter ego, if you like. This alter ego can manifest itself in different ways. For example, a normally quiet, unassuming person may suddenly become loud, arrogant, and bossy. Those who are unfamiliar with such behavior may suddenly change their minds about him or her. As Steiner explained, each of us has an inner beast that lies dormant within us. His treatment helped release this beast so that the patient could cope with a particular situation. As soon as the source of stress disappeared, the animal retired, and the person could, in theory, continue to live normally. From Ron's point of view, this could lead to the awakening of the person's inner Hyde, a being hell-bent on destruction with no inhibitions. No, Ron decided, his solution needed to be more permanent, but without the devastating and potentially fatal side effects. Naturally, none of these studies were approved by the FDA, but Steiner claimed to have conducted several successful tests on humans. However, Ron was intrigued by Steiner's work and vowed to one day visit the man after graduating. By age 18, Ron received his first doctorate and a year later received his second, surprising everyone. He also earned a black belt in karate, which he did mainly for the mental discipline and physical fitness that he really enjoyed. Mark, of course, was not surprised and celebrated all of his grandson's achievements. As always, Mark attended all of Ron's ceremonies. No other family members accompanied him. Ron wrote to his family several times while he was at MIT, but stopped when he received no response. They didn't send him anything for Christmas or his birthday, but Mark always did. Meanwhile, Ron sent out resumes to a number of companies and conducted several Skype interviews with potential employers. He received several job offers, but after careful consideration, he decided to accept an offer from a large and reputable pharmaceutical company located half an hour from his home. Not only did she have a huge research facility, but she also offered the best compensation package of all the offers received. It was during this time that Ron met Nancy. Nancy, fresh out of high school, worked as a waitress at the diner he liked to go to when he wanted a break from campus. She was always very nice to him, and he found himself very attracted to her. It took him a while to work up the courage to ask her out, but to his surprise, she agreed. She wasn't his first girlfriend he'd dated, and even had sex with a few other girls at school, but he didn't see them as anything more than friends or classmates. But Nancy was different. She was impressed that such a young man could earn a second doctorate at MIT. She believed that this man was on his way to success, and as she reasoned, it could be a way out of the hell in which she found herself. Over time, she fell in love with him, but most of all, she was attracted by the idea of connecting her life with such a successful man. Of course, Ron did not know this and managed to fall in love with her himself. He was amazed when she agreed to his marriage proposal. The large diamond ring he offered her was very helpful in this regard. Mark was delighted to hear the news not only that Ron had landed his dream job, but that he was getting married. "Ron, you know you have a lot of assets to think about," he said. "I'm sure Nancy is a good girl, but I really think you should have a prenuptial agreement to protect yourself." "You're right, Grandpa," said Ron. "I didn't think about that." "You know what, son," Mark said. "I'll have my lawyer draw it up for you, okay?" "That's great, thanks," Ron said. Mark's lawyer drafted an agreement that was fair to both parties, but protected Ron's finances in the event of a divorce. It also spelled out the conditions in case of treason. After reading it, Ron handed the document to Nancy. "What is this?" she asked. "It's called a prenuptial agreement," Ron said. "It is designed to protect both of us in the event of a divorce. I'm not planning anything like that, but you know that about half of all marriages end in divorce." Okay, she said, signing the documents. Ron sent the papers back to Mark. Now he was all set. He would soon graduate, bring Nancy home, marry her, go to Hawaii for his honeymoon, and return to start his new life with a new job and wife. Mark, meanwhile, bought a cozy two-story house with a full basement for Ron and his new bride. Ron offered to pay for the house, but Mark refused, calling it a wedding gift. Mark knew that Ron had always dreamed of having a basement that he could turn into a home laboratory. The next few months flew by for Ron. After receiving his second doctorate, he took Nancy out of the apartment she shared with her older sister. Apart from her clothes, Nancy had nothing, not even a car. She rode a small scooter. Ron loaded her belongings, including the scooter, into the U-Haul trailer with his belongings and headed home. Nancy's eyes widened when she saw the house Mark bought for them. She had never lived in such a beautiful house. Ron was impressed. The house was nice without being too fancy, and it had a nice yard with a covered deck. Mark even bought new furniture to help them get started in life. They unloaded the trailer and quickly unpacked the items. Ron parked the scooter in the garage and promised to buy his new wife a car when they returned from Hawaii. A few days later, Ron took Nancy to meet Mark and the family at his parents' house. He didn't know what to expect since he hadn't heard anything about them for a long time. Mark hugged them both and welcomed Nancy to the family. Ron's parents stayed away and barely spoke to him other than to comment on how thin he was. They hugged Nancy and welcomed her to the family as well. "I was hoping to get something from you while I was gone," Ron said. "It's been probably 4 or 5 years now. I sent you my address." "Sorry," Ron's father said. "You know I'm not a fan of writing." "You didn't even send a card for Christmas," asked Ron. "We are so busy that we forget," his mother said. "We don't really like sending cards and things like that. You understand how this happens." "Yeah, I think I understand," Ron said. His brothers entered the room. George and John nodded at Ron and glanced at Nancy. Both looked like smaller versions of his father in their boozy tank tops and dirty jeans. Neither of them appeared to have shaved recently, and they had a bit of stubble. "Well," George said with a grin, "the kid finally found himself a girlfriend." He walked up to Nancy and began to examine her. "She's okay, baby. Have you learned how to have sex with her? Or are you still not succeeding?" John and Ron's father chuckled until Nancy's face turned purple. Mark walked up to the two boys angrily. "Stop it, you two," he said. "Show some respect to your brother's fiancée." He turned to Bob. "Your mother would be very disappointed if she saw this." Bob lowered his eyes, ashamed. "Well, Big Daddy is protecting the brainiac as always," John said. "Nothing seems to change." "Well, if you two would show just a little bit of initiative, I'd help you the same way I helped Ron," Mark said, "and how he helped Lisa. But you seem to be happy with working with a broom and mop bucket." Ron looked at his two older brothers. "What?" he asked with a smile. "Are you two cleaners? Seriously? After all your talk about becoming football stars? Do you really still live at home?" "Hey, smart guy, this helps pay the bills," George said. "Where is Lisa?" Ron asked his mother. "She moved out a while ago," his mother said. "I rented an apartment and am studying to become a nurse. She asked me to give you her contact information. She still lives in the city." She handed Ron a card with Lisa's phone number and address. "So, I heard you got a job," Bob said to Ron. "Yes," said Ron. "I will work as a researcher in a pharmaceutical laboratory." Bob nodded his head. "Okay," said Bob. "I'm happy for you. Really glad." "So, will you come to the wedding?" asked Ron. "Or will you miss it too?" "We will come," said his mother. Ron looked at his brothers with disgust. "Don't forget to wash, shave, and put on clean clothes," he told them. George looked at Ron with hatred in his eyes. "Remember what I told you when you left, baby?" he said. He looked at Nancy with a devious grin on his face. "I haven't forgotten," said Ron. "Remember, I have a photographic memory." He turned and motioned to Nancy that it was time to leave. "I'm so glad to see you again, Ron," his mother said as he left. Ron simply nodded his head. Ron simply nodded his head as he left. "I'm really sorry about all this," Mark said on the sidewalk outside. "I should have warned you. I thought they would at least be able to treat you with respect after all these years." "I'm not sure I want them to come to the wedding," I said. "I can't let this happen there." "Ron, they are still your family," Mark said, "with all its shortcomings and advantages." "Am I going to experience this with Lisa too?" asked Ron. Mark shook his head. "No," he said. "She has changed a lot since you left. I think you'll be surprised. I'll contact you later. I need to talk to them and bring order to this situation." He looked at Nancy and hugged her. "Please forgive them," he said. When Ron and Nancy got into the car, they drove off. "Is this what you had to grow up with?" she asked. Ron nodded. "Yeah, but it wasn't that bad back then," Ron said. "I don't know what happened." When they got home, Ron took out his phone and called the number he had for Lisa. She answered on the second ring. "Lisa, this is Ron," he said. "Ronnie," she exclaimed, "are you home already?" "Yes, I'm home," he said. "Listen, I live not far from you. Can I come over for a few minutes?" she asked. "Of course," he said. "Great," said Lisa. "I'll be with you soon." "Do you know where I live?" he asked. "Yes, I was with my grandfather when he chose this house for you." "I hope you like him," she said. "Yeah, we like it," Ron said. "Great," she said. "See you in a few minutes." About 15 minutes later, Ron saw a red Toyota pull into the driveway. Lisa got out of the car, carrying her bag, and walked to the front door. Ron had already opened the door and greeted her. Lisa put down her bag and hugged him tightly. He was surprised, but still returned her hug. "So good to see you again, Ronnie," she said. "And I'm glad to see you, Lisa," he replied. He introduced her to Nancy, and the girls hugged. "Welcome to the family, Nancy," Lisa said. "Nice to meet you." "Me too," Nancy replied. Lisa handed Ron the bag. He looked inside and saw a glass baking dish with something inside and looked back at his sister. "It's not much, but I thought you'd like tuna casserole," Lisa said. "I know this was your favorite food as a child." "It's still my favorite," said Ron. "Thank you. This will save us from having to cook on our first day here. Please come in and have a seat." He took the casserole to the kitchen and put it in the refrigerator. "Do you want something to drink? Coca-Cola? Coffee?" "There's enough water for me," said Lisa. "Me too, please," Nancy said. "Sure," Ron said, taking 3 bottles of water. He brought them and sat down next to his bride. "You look great, Lisa," Ron said. "Are you okay?" "Yes," she replied. "I'm studying to be a nurse and work part-time in a hospital. I took out a student loan and my grandfather helps with rent and utilities, so I'm doing fine. I hear that you found a good job." "Yes, it is," said Ron. "I'll start working as soon as I get back from my honeymoon." "I'm so glad to hear that," she said. She became a little thoughtful. "Have you been home yet?" "Yeah, we just got back from there," said Ron. "What's happening? I haven't heard from them for about 5 years, and when I return home, it feels like they don't care." "The parents are not doing very well," Lisa said. "About a year after you left, the plant closed and father lost his job. The only thing he could find was work as a cleaner. Then the boys got injured playing football and lost their scholarships, so they went to work with their father on night shifts. After finishing school, Mom and Dad told them they could stay and convert the basement into an apartment if they didn't mind helping out around the house. So they agreed. "Was this the reason you left?" asked Ron. "Well, that was the beginning," she said. "I didn't want to work with the guys as a cleaner. I always dreamed of becoming a nurse, but my dad said he couldn't afford the tuition. My grandfather helped me get a student loan and provided me with support so I could move out." "Couldn't you have stayed at home?" asked Ron. She shook her head. "No," she said. "You know guys have always been bastards. Sorry," she added, turning to Nancy. "I've heard worse," Nancy said. Lisa continued. "Well, they set up a basement for the guys," Lisa said. "And all 3 father, John and George, became even bigger bastards. Grandpa offered to help them, but all they were interested in was playing football and chasing girls. Then I found them bringing the girls into the basement. Several times I even saw my father join them. The whole place was starting to smell terrible. I couldn't stand it, so I left." "And Mom allowed this to happen?" asked Ron. "She was unhappy, but after her father yelled at her, she stopped saying anything," Lisa said. She was silent for a moment, and Ron knew there was something else on her mind, but she didn't want to talk about it. He decided not to insist yet. Then she turned to Nancy. "Listen, I'm free tomorrow afternoon," she said. "Do you want to go shopping with me? Maybe we can buy what you need for the wedding." "That would be great," Nancy said, "but I don't have much money." "Don't worry," said Ron. "I'll give you my credit card. Just don't spend it all, okay?" Nancy and Lisa both laughed. "I'll try," Nancy said with a smile. The next day, they spent the entire day shopping for wedding dresses and everything women want for their wedding. Nancy got her hair and nails done, and the girls had lunch at a nice restaurant. In the evening, they finally returned home, and Ron was amazed at the number of packages he pulled out of Lisa's car. He also noticed that the girls got along very well, which made him happy. "Tomorrow afternoon, I'll take you and pick out a tuxedo for you, big boy," Lisa told Ron. He looked at her in surprise. "Big boy," he asked to himself. "Where did this come from?" Okay," he said. The next day, Lisa arrived around 1 p.m., and they went into town where Ron tried on a tuxedo. On the way, Lisa noticed that Ron was constantly looking around in the car, nervous. "What's wrong, Ron?" she asked. "I'm just waiting for something to jump out and spray me with permanent ink or something," he said. She laughed. "Do you think I would do such a thing?" she asked. "You should have done this before I went to college," he said. She looked away, embarrassed. "Have I been that bad to you?" she asked. "You all were," he said. "You were not as cruel as George and John, but you always seemed to be the one who followed their lead. I could never understand why you all hated me so much." "Sorry about that, Ron," she said. "I never hated you, and I'm sorry if that's the impression you got." "Then why?" asked Ron. "Why were you all so mean to me?" "I can't speak for the guys," she said. "I was a little jealous of you and mostly followed George and John. Now that you mention it, I realize that I was really cruel to you. But that's all in the past. I'd like to get to know the real you, if you don't mind. Bury the hatchet. So who are you, and what did you do with my sister? And why were you jealous of me?" Ron asked, laughing. She laughed too. "You've always been so smart," she said, "and Grandpa always stood up for you. I remember you spending so much time reading his books. You couldn't get enough of all the books in his library. Then, when you two started speaking to each other in Klingon, I felt like you had a connection that neither of us would ever have. Are you still doing that? Do you speak Klingon?" Ron laughed. "Not so often now," he said. "But it was funny. Trust me, you haven't experienced all of Shakespeare until you've read it in the original Klingon," he added, referring to a line from a scene in the Star Trek movie. They both laughed at this, remembering an incident from his school days. After the fitting, they went for a snack and continued talking. "Nancy seems like a really nice girl," Lisa said. "I'm glad you found someone who loves you." "Thank you," he said. "What about you? Do you have Mr. Perfect in your life?" "In a way," she said. "I'm dating someone now. I don't know where this will lead, but at the moment everything is fine." "I got the impression yesterday that you had something else on your mind," Ron said. "Is everything okay with you and your family? Did something happen?" Lisa lowered her eyes, her face turning slightly red. "Yes, but I'm not ready to talk about it now," she said. "I'm just glad Grandpa was there." Ron nodded his head in understanding. "Well, if you ever want to talk, I'm here," he said. Lisa smiled, looking at him. "Thanks, Ron," she said. "Perhaps I will." Ron and Nancy's wedding went well. Her sister came from the East and was her maid of honor. Ron's old school friend was his best man. Mark had the pleasure of walking Nancy down the aisle. When the time came, Ron lifted her veil and kissed her like a husband for the first time. He felt a slightly bitter taste during the kiss, but tried not to pay attention to it. Perhaps it was just nerves, he thought. The reception went overall well. Of course, Ron danced with his new wife, then with his mother and Lisa. George, John, and his father danced with Nancy. As they sat at their table, his brothers approached him. "Well, baby, you did it after all," said George. "You really got married." He looked at Nancy and grabbed his groin. "Remember, if you want a real man, come to me," he told her with a grin on his face. John grinned too. However, Ron didn't find it funny and stood up from his chair. George looked at him. "Are you going to beat me, baby? If you want, let me know." "Just stay away from me," Ron said calmly, looking George in the eye with clenched fists. George sensed something different about his little brother and wisely decided not to continue. "Hey, just kidding, kid," he said, smiling. He turned and, signaling to John, left the reception. At that moment, Lisa came up and hugged her brother. "I'm really happy for you, Ron," she said. "Don't pay any attention to these idiots." "Thank you, Lisa," he said. She turned to Nancy and hugged her, kissing her on the cheek. Nancy responded in kind. After Lisa left, Bob and June approached them. Bob smiled and shook Ron's hand. "You did great, son," he said. "I'm happy for you. Congratulations." "Thanks, Dad," Ron said. Bob smiled and hugged Nancy. "Welcome to the family," he told her. She hugged him back and thanked him as June hugged Ron. "I'm so happy for you too," June told Ron. "Congratulations." "Thanks, Mom," Ron said. She hugged and kissed Nancy, who returned the favor. Mark also wished them all the best. "I'm so proud of you, son," he said. "You have a wonderful woman. Take care of her." "I will, Grandpa," said Ron. "Thank you for everything." Mark hugged Nancy and welcomed her to the family as well. After that, Ron and Nancy went home. They planned to spend the night there and fly early in the morning to Hawaii for their honeymoon. Nancy giggled as Ron picked her up and carried her over the threshold. "Oh my," she said, "so big and strong. Take me to bed, my husband. I want you so much." Ron smiled and carried his new wife upstairs, laying her down on the bed. Although Ron was much smaller than his brothers, he was far from a weakling. They undressed and fell into bed, naked, showering each other with kisses. Ron noticed that the bitter taste in her mouth had disappeared. "And I love you, my wife," he whispered back. The next morning, he woke up to Nancy pleasuring him. Then she gave him a hot kiss. He noticed that it tasted the same as the one in the church the day before. What the hell? Ron asked himself. Did she please anyone at the wedding? He didn't say anything, but put it on the back burner. He didn't want to ruin their honeymoon. They flew to Hawaii and enjoyed their time on the islands, making love at every opportunity. When Ron returned, he got to work and was soon immersed in developing new and more effective drugs to treat patients. At the same time, he began to equip his home laboratory to continue his personal research. About 2 months after returning from Hawaii, Nancy approached him about going to school to become a nurse. "I think it's a great idea," Ron said. "Why don't you go to the college where Lisa studies and enrolls? Don't worry about the cost. Just bring me all the necessary documents and I will take care of everything." She hugged him and kissed him. "Oh, thank you so much," she exclaimed. "I'll go tomorrow. Lisa said registration starts soon, so I'll sign up. I think she said the 2-year program costs about $18,000. This is fine." "Of course," said Ron. "And if you want to study further after the 2-year program, let me know." "You are the best husband in the world," she said. "Thank you, thank you, thank you. Just wait until evening, I'll wear you crazy." Ron smiled. "I'll get you into it," he said. Over the next year plus, Nancy focused on her studies. Many of her classes were in the evening, and she told Ron that sometimes she and other students would get together after class to study together. Ron looked at her textbooks and realized that she really had a lot of material to cover in a short time, so he tolerated her absence and helped his wife with cooking and household chores. He also spent the evenings when she was not home working on his own project. By this time, his home laboratory was fully equipped, and he had made significant progress in his research. After testing several formulas on lab rats, he concluded that he was close to starting human trials. He thought about this for a long time before deciding to test the drug on himself. Unsurprisingly, the formula worked. Within a few days of starting to inject himself with very small and diluted doses, Ron noticed significant changes in himself. His muscle mass increased by about 3%, and he felt much more confident than ever before. Unfortunately, the physical changes only lasted a few hours. Ron realized that he would either have to increase the dose or continue to administer the drug daily, perhaps several times a day. But he wondered, what could this lead to? Could he become dependent on this drug? Will he turn into a real-life Hyde? What long-term effects might this cause? He decided to continue testing the drug on his rats before reintroducing it to himself. During this time, Ron also noticed that the frequency of sex between him and Nancy had decreased significantly. Ron understood that her studies were stressful and required a lot of time to prepare, but it seemed to him that she spent more nights away from home than in it. And he realized she often didn't return home until midnight or later. She has also become more irritable with him over the past few months. When he mentioned the decrease in the frequency of their intimate relationships, she became irritated, telling him that studying was taking up all of her time. She always seemed tired and complained of headaches. He decided to talk to Lisa about this one evening when Nancy was not at home. By this time, Lisa had already completed her studies and was working full-time at the hospital. "Lisa," he said, "can you shed some light on this situation? She seems to be out almost every night until midnight or later. I understand that the program is complex, but does it really take that much time?" "Oh yes," said Lisa. "This program is really very complex, and there is a huge amount of information that needs to be absorbed in a short period of time. I also spent many late evenings studying with classmates in a common room. Why are you asking? Do you suspect she's doing something else? I don't know, said Ron. I don't want to blame her without reason. That's smart of you, little brother, she said. And I don't say that in a condescending way. I'm really glad you decided to talk to me first. Remember, not everyone is as smart as you. I think you're right, he said. Are you okay with her? She asked. She has become very irritable lately, and our personal time has almost disappeared, he said. Yes, I understand how this can happen, Lisa said. Just be patient, Ron. She is going through a difficult period, and she needs your support. Hold on. Everything will work out. You'll see. I hope you're right, he said. Thank you for taking the time to talk to me. You're welcome, little brother, she said with a smile. A couple of weeks later, Ron and Nancy were at a company meeting. He was talking with some of his colleagues when he suddenly realized that Nancy was nowhere to be found. Where is she? Ron asked himself. She was just here. He walked around the room trying to find her, but didn't see her anywhere. A couple of hours later, he noticed her heading towards him. He went to meet her, happy that he had finally found her. Where have you been? He asked. I've been looking everywhere for you. Oh, a couple of your colleagues gave me a little tour of the place, she said. Very impressive. Now I understand why you like to spend so much time here. That night at home, she was covered in it. He enjoyed the sex, but noticed that bitter taste in her mouth again. What the hell, he thought. Everything returned to normal, and 2 weeks later his friend told him the bad news. Ron put his head in his hands and cried over the loss of his marriage. I wonder how many other men she's slept with since they started dating, he thought. He took out his phone and called the only person who could help him. Hey, son, what's wrong? Mark asked when he answered the call. Grandpa, I think Nancy is cheating on me, Ron said. Come, let's talk, son, Mark said. Ron ended the call and drove to his grandfather's house. Mark listened intently as Ron told him what he had learned. What should I do, grandfather? Asked Ron. I don't know where to start. Well, said Mark, it's time for you to use your big brain. The first thing we need to do is collect evidence that will be admissible in court. Once we have them, you can contact a lawyer and file for divorce. Do you still have a prenuptial agreement? Yes, there is, said Ron. Mark nodded his head. Perhaps the court will order you to undergo counseling, Mark said. Do you think you can get over this and make peace with her? Ron shook his head. I don't think so, grandfather, he said. She's become a complete bitch to me lately, and she gets home well after midnight almost every night. Well, we might need to hire a private investigator to follow her, Mark said. I know a couple good ones in the area, so I'll get into it. Do you have the spare house key I gave you? Ron took the key out of the ring and handed it to Mark. We will need to connect the house to audio and video in case she does something wrong at home. When does she usually leave for class? I think her first period starts at 11:30 this term, Ron said. She takes a full load and studies until about 9:30 p.m., and then supposedly studies until late at night. I talked to Lisa, and she said it wasn't that unusual considering the classes she takes. Said Mark. We will soon know the truth. In the meantime, you need to remain calm. Try to act normal around her. Don't make a scene with her, and don't accuse her until we have proof. And don't do anything stupid. I won't, said Ron. You know, I'm glad to hear that you're talking to Lisa, Mark said. Maybe you should spend more time with her. She has matured a lot since she left home. Did something happen to her at home? Asked Ron. Yes, said Mark. But I'm not sure what exactly. Don't push her. She'll tell you when she's ready. Got it, Ron said. Mark hugged Ron. Now go home and try to act normal around Nancy, Mark said. I'll call and see if we can start something tomorrow. I'll let you know what's going on. I'm really sorry to hear this. I thought Nancy was a wonderful girl. It's hard to imagine that she could do this to you. But don't worry. No matter what we find out, we will deal with it. Thanks, Grandpa, Ron said before walking away. When he returned home, He noticed that Nancy had not yet returned, which was not surprising lately. An idea occurred to him, and he pulled out a small webcam from his stash and set it up in his bedroom, figuring that if anything happened there, he would film it. The camera was small enough that Nancy didn't notice it right away. The camera had a motion sensor and started recording if something happened in the room. He went down to his laboratory and checked the camera's operation, then took up his personal project to take his mind off things. After testing his lab rats, he noticed that the latest version of his formula worked longer than the previous ones, and even better, there were no negative side effects. He made several calculations and decided to try it on himself again. He knew it was risky, but he felt it was necessary. First, he recorded his readings: heart rate, breathing, oxygen levels, and blood pressure, then administered a small dose of the drug. It took about 45 minutes before he felt the familiar burning sensation that indicated the drug was working. He recorded his readings again and was relieved to see that they remained normal. He walked to the back of his lab where he kept his gym equipment. He changed into shorts and a t-shirt and began training on the punching bag. After some time, he noticed that his strength and endurance had improved significantly. Looking at himself, he saw that his muscle mass had increased slightly. He measured his arms, legs, and chest and compared them with previous measurements. He was pleased to see that the increase was greater than before. But he thought, how long will this last? He did his karate training and found that he could do it with more speed and strength than before. After an hour of training, he checked his performance again and was pleased with the result. Perhaps, he thought, he had finally found the formula he was looking for. But he didn't want to force things too much. He quickly showered and returned upstairs, locking the security doors of his laboratory. He thought he had about half an hour left before Nancy came home. However, that evening she surprised him by returning 15 minutes earlier than usual. "Hello, stranger," he said as she entered. "Glad you came home early, that's rare." He hugged her and kissed her deeply, noticing that her taste was normal this time. After the kiss, she looked at him in surprise. "If I get this kind of greeting for coming home early, I'll do it every night," she said. "Where did this suddenly come from?" "I just miss you," he said. "How was your day?" "Not bad," she said. "It was mostly repetition. We'll have tests soon." "Well then," he said, "why don't we do something else again?" "For example?" she asked. She squeaked as he lifted her with ease. "Wow," Ron thought, "either she's lost weight or I've really gotten stronger." "Like our wedding night," he said as he walked up the stairs. "You mean," she began. "Yeah," he said. "I am torn by desire, and I want you. Right now." She smiled and wrapped her arms around him. "Lead," she said. Ron carried her into the bedroom and laid her on the bed before beginning to undress. "I want to see you naked," he said, feeling aroused. Nancy began to undress, teasing him with her body. "Do you think you can handle this?" she asked, teasing him. "Oh, yes," he growled. Having undressed, he stood up and examined her. She looked at him in surprise. "What's gotten into you?" she asked. "You look different." "I was training," he said, "and I want you. Do you see?" he asked. "I want you until I lose consciousness, wife," he whispered in her ear. "Then do it, my husband," she replied. They had passionate sex. "Oh my God, it was just incredible," she said. He kissed her deeply. "Yes, it was," he said, lying down next to her. He hugged her and held her tightly to him. She hugged him, noticing that his body seemed stronger and more muscular than usual. "Are you sure you didn't take anything?" she asked. "You seem, I don't know, different." "Diet and exercise," he replied. "We haven't seen each other that often lately, so naturally I'll seem a little different to you. When was the last time we even had sex like this?" "So how is it now?" she asked again. "To be honest, I don't remember it being like that, but I'm not complaining." "I'm glad to hear that," he said. Maybe, he thought, this would keep her from cheating, or not. At least it would give her something to think about. "You know, you are the only woman I need." He felt her shrink a little, perhaps out of guilt. And you are the only man I need, she said. Is it true? He asked. She looked at him in surprise. Does he know something? She thought. Of course, Ron, she said. I love you, and only you. I'm glad to hear that, he said. I love you too, and only you. It would break my heart if anything changed that. She clenched again when he said that and hugged him tighter. It would break my heart too, she said quietly. He kissed her forehead. Why don't we take a weekend and go somewhere for a while, he suggested. Maybe we can reconnect with each other. I would love that, she said. Maybe at the end of the semester. I have tests coming up, and I really need to study. I understand, he said. Just remember, if there's anything I can do to help, tell me. Thank you, dear, she said. I'll tell you. I think it's time for us to go to bed, he said. I need to get to the office early. That sounds like a good idea, she said. Good night. I love you. Good night, honey, he said. I love you too. They finally fell asleep, and Ron woke up to find his wife pleasuring him. Good morning, lover, she said. Good morning, beautiful, he replied. They kissed, and Ron began getting ready for work, while Nancy threw on her robe and went downstairs to make coffee and breakfast. They had breakfast, and everything seemed the same as it had been in the early days of their marriage. Ron hoped this would become the new normal. After breakfast, he praised his wife for her cooking skills, kissed her, and walked out the door. I love you, he said. I love you too, she replied. Don't forget that I will be returning home quite late today. I have a lot of studying to do. Understand, try not to stay too long, he said with a smile. She smiled back. I'll try, she said. That day, after a fairly productive day at work, Ron returned home and turned on the computer in his lab to see if the webcam had recorded anything. The camera successfully captured their last night and activated again when Nancy went to the bathroom. He fast-forwarded the video, hoping nothing more would happen. In his mind, the only things that should have been filmed were her getting ready for class and changing her bed sheets. But the camera caught something else. About 30 minutes after he left, the camera was activated again as Nancy walked into the room, followed by his father and two brothers. What the hell are they doing there, he thought. Nancy sat down on the bed as the three men began to take off their clothes. I don't think I can do this today, guys, she said in the video. Why the hell not? Asked George. What do you mean when you say I can't? Asked John. I don't know for sure, but I think Ron suspects something, she said. Like what? Asked Bob. Yes, what exactly? George repeated. You didn't see him last night, she told them. He was like a completely different person. What, you let him have sex with you last night? Asked John. After we specifically told you not to let him near you for a week? I had no choice, she said. He just picked me up several times, and honestly, it was the best sex we've ever had. What? Asked George. What do you mean he took you, and you let him? You bitch. Bob raised his hand. Wait, he said. What do you mean other, Nancy? He was like a kinder version of the three of you, she said. He was stronger, tougher, more confident. Hell, he was even bigger than usual. I thought he had taken Viagra or something, but he just said it was a result of diet and exercise. He's doing something in his lab, Bob said. We need to get in there and find out what it is. No, you can't do that, Nancy said. He has several security doors there, and if anyone tries to break into them, he and the police will be notified immediately. Do you know what he's working on? Asked George. Nancy shook her head. I have no idea, she said. So we just forget about our plan to get you pregnant and have him raise the baby thinking it's his? Asked John. I think we should put this plan on hold for a while, she said. I want to finish my studies first and get a job with good conditions. After that, we can return to this issue. Hell no, George said. I don't want to wait that long. He looked at his father. Maybe we should move to Plan B. Bob nodded. Nancy looked at them. What do you mean Plan B? She asked. Well, if we can't fuck this week, cuckold indirectly, we'll fuck him directly, John said. and we'll get it on camera. Yes, and we'll send this video to his boss and colleagues, George said. The three men laughed. You can't be serious, Nancy said. Oh yeah, we're damn serious, John said, and you will help us frame him. What? Asked Nancy. You want me to set him up? Yes, said George. What if I don't want to? She asked. Then we'll just tell him about your wedding day, John said, about how you had sex with us. The three men laughed again. And then we'll show him the video. Do you think he'll ever want to touch you again? Nancy lowered her head, embarrassed. What about your grandfather? Asked Nancy. He'll never let you do that. Yes, said George. He has a mortgage on the house. He'll throw us out on the street in an instant or send us to prison. Don't worry about Big Daddy, Bob said. George and John nodded. So, bitch, John said, are you with us, or should we take you to a bad part of town and turn you into a crack addict who will have sex for a fix? Just don't hurt him, please, she sobbed. When do you want to do it? Soon, said George. We'll let you know. In the meantime, play the role of a kind, loving wife until we get everything organized. Don't let the little worm suspect anything. Understood? Nancy nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. Got it, she said quietly. Great, George said, unbuttoning his pants. When the men had finished, they got dressed. On the way out, John turned to Nancy. Remember what we said, bitch, he told her, and don't let him touch you again for a week if you value your life. Finally, Nancy was left alone, and as Ron saw, she covered her face with her hands and began to sob. The video ended when she finally stood up and went to the bathroom. He copied it onto a flash drive and, realizing he had just witnessed a conspiracy to commit a crime, picked up the phone to call the police and alert Mark. But he didn't have time to make the call because his phone rang when he was already holding it in hands. The screen showed that Lisa was calling, and he answered. Ron, thank God I got through to you, she said. You need to go to the hospital immediately. What happened, Lisa? He asked. This is Grandpa, she said. He was shot. He was released from surgery, but he doesn't look very good. Please hurry up and come here. Meet me at the emergency room. They ended the call and Ron ran up the stairs, locking the safety doors of the lab. He drove as quickly as he could to the hospital and met Lisa in the emergency room. She grabbed his hand and led him to the recovery area where Mark lay. His eyes were closed and his breathing was uneven. He was hooked up to tubes and wires attached to his body, and Ron could see that his vitals were out of whack. What's happened? He asked Lisa. Based on the police, he was caught between two rival gangs during a drive-by shooting, she said. He was hit several times. It doesn't look good at all. Ron agreed and monitored his vital signs. He pulled up a chair and sat down next to Mark and Lisa. She laid her head on his shoulders and cried. He hugged her and tried to console her. Suddenly, Mark jerked in his bed. Ron and Lisa examined his vitals and found signs of a heart attack. Suddenly, the code blue announcement sounded and the room quickly filled with medical personnel. Ron and Lisa did not interfere with their work, but it was in vain. While they watched, Mark's vital signs remained at the same level, and nothing the specialists did made any difference. The doctor examined him one last time and noted the time of Mark's death in his file. Before leaving, they disconnected him from the medical equipment and pulled a sheet over his face. Ron leaned over Mark, hot tears streaming down his face. Lisa sobbed with him, placing her hand on Ron's shoulder. As Ron mourned his grandfather, a rage began to build within him. He felt his entire body trembling with emotion, and he was filled with the desire to kill. The rage continued to build within him until he couldn't take it anymore. Suddenly, he threw his head back and let out a blood-curdling scream. Lisa stepped back from him, shocked. A couple of nurses came running to see what was going on, but by then Ron had calmed down. I need to get out of here, Ron said. I'll call tomorrow. Please do it, Lisa said fearfully. She had never seen him like this before and was very worried about him. Ron left the curtained area and headed towards the door. At the exit, he was met by his father and brothers. What's happened? Bob asked him. Ron grabbed him by the collar and slammed him into a nearby truck with hatred in his eyes. As if you don't know? He asked. Bob shook his head. He had never seen Ron so physical before. No, I don't know, he said. Honestly, no. If I ever find out that you had anything to do with the shooting of your grandfather, then God help me, I will destroy you, you worthless person. Peta, he growled, using a Klingon insult. Bob looked at his youngest child in fear. He shook his head. No, please, Ron. Trust me, I have nothing to do with this, he pleaded. Ron threw it back to the ground, and in his peripheral vision saw George begin to swing it. He never made contact as Ron Roundhouse kicked him to the side of his face. Ron looked at John with anger in his eyes. Do you want pain too, idiot? Ron growled. John shook his head, eyes wide. He held his hands in front of him. Who is this madman, he thought, looking at his younger brother. No, Ron, please. Enough, he said. Then stay away from me, said Ron. He looked at Bob. Are you going to take care of your father's funeral, or am I going to have to do it for you? I'll take care of it, Bob said, standing up. I'm so sorry, Ron. Is it true? I know how much your grandfather meant to you. I'll take care of everything. You better, Ron said before walking away. He called his boss from work and asked for bereavement leave. I'm really sorry, Ron, his boss said. Go ahead, take the next 5 days off. We've got everything taken care of. Thank you, boss, Ron said, ending the conversation. He got into the car and drove home, thinking about revenge. He swore that they would all pay for what they did to him. As he drove, part of his mind was going through formulas and calculations, while another part of his mind was focused on driving. It was something he had mastered a while ago, and now it had become second nature to him. His face twisted into an evil grin as a plan came to him. Oh yeah, he thought to himself, all the bastards will pay for their betrayal. Returning home, he turned off all the cameras and then returned to his laboratory, his head filled with formulas. He went straight to work, knowing he didn't have much time. He checked some things from his previous experiments and his extensive computer library and adjusted them if necessary. The first solution simply had to work because there was no time to test or reformulate. He worked like a man possessed until he finally got the mixture he was looking for. Looking around, he found one more thing he would need to make his job easier and set it aside. He grabbed what looked like a turkey baster and drank a significant dose of his newly created solution before setting it aside. Now all he could do was wait. He didn't have to wait long before he heard Nancy's car pull into the garage. He grabbed what he needed and ran up the stairs, heading to the kitchen. He poured Nancy a glass of sherry, knowing she would want it before bed. He turned around, glass in hand, as Nancy entered the house from the garage. Is this from me? She asked, reaching for the glass. Of course, he said, handing her the letter. How was your day? Busy as hell, she sighed, drinking. We were checking everything for. She dropped her glass and almost fell to the floor, but Ron caught her before she fainted. He picked her up and carried her upstairs, laying her on the bed. He stripped her naked and saw bite marks on her chest. He placed a pillow under her bottom, lifting it up enough to do what he needed. He went downstairs and lay down on the futon in his laboratory. He woke up at 6:30 a.m. He quickly showered, got dressed, and grabbed a cup of coffee. He had a lot to do today. He grabbed his laptop and the flash drive with the video he'd taken the day before, then wrote a note for Nancy, returning the cameras to active mode, telling her he needed to start his workday early. He didn't mention anything about Mark's death. On the way, he called Lisa. Hey, sis, he said. Do you mind if I come over to your place and make us breakfast? Well, okay, she replied. Are you feeling better this morning? Yes, a little, he said. I slept at night, and that helped. Okay, she said. Okay, I'll see you in a few minutes then. A few minutes later, Lisa let Ron into her apartment. She showed him the kitchen, and he began breaking eggs for an omelet. Are you sure you can handle it? She asked. Oh, yes, he said. I'll make some coffee, she said. Sounds great, he replied. So what's the matter? Lisa asked when Ron served the omelets. I have something you need to watch, Ron said, pulling out his laptop and flash drive. After he plugged in the headphones, he handed them to her. Watch this, he said, turning on the video. Her eyes went wide as she watched Nancy have sex with 3 men. When the video ended, she took off her headphones and wiped away her tears. Oh my God, she said. I can't believe they could do this to you. Do you think Dad could have been involved in what happened to Grandpa? I thought so at first, but when I looked at the timeline, it just didn't add up, he said. He just didn't have enough time to organize it. I heard you got a little mad at them in the parking lot, she said. Yeah, a little, Ron replied. Will Dad take care of Grandpa's funeral? She nodded. He said he would take care of it, she replied. Ron looked at his sister for a few minutes before speaking. I need to know the truth, Lisa, he said. The whole truth. About what? She asked. What happened to make you leave home? He asked. Her eyes filled with tears and her face turned red. She nodded slowly, unable to look Ron in the eye. You can tell me, I'll be there for you. She began to cry furiously. He hugged her and let her cry on his shoulder. He allowed her to let it all out. Finally, she sat up and looked at him. Do you remember how we all played in the basement? She asked. Yes, he replied. I always ended up at the bottom of the pile. She laughed. Well, after you left, I was at the bottom of the pile, she said. The first time this happened was about a year after you left. My brothers and I were in the basement, and we were just fooling around like usual. Mom and Dad were out that evening, and the brothers got beer. Later, I realized that they had drugged me with something. I'm going to see a lawyer today, so I'll ask about it, Ron said. I think I read somewhere that in our state there is no statute of limitations for such crimes, but I don't keep my finger on the pulse of the legislation. And yes, it was a crime. So are you going to divorce Nancy? Asked Lisa. Yes, he replied. I can't live with this. Okay, she said. I'm really sorry for you, Ron. Believe me, there are many girls who would dream of a man like you, and not all of them are like her. And I'm really sorry for the way I treated you when we were younger. I know we were children, but that doesn't justify my actions. Ron smiled and hugged his sister. Everything is fine, he said. Thank you for the apology, and I accept it. Well, I have a lot to do today, so I better get going. Call if you need anything, and I'll let you know what I find out, okay? Sounds like a plan, she said. Thanks for stopping by, Ron. And thanks for the breakfast. Maybe I'll ask you to do it again. He smiled and kissed her on the cheek. Anytime, he said. At that moment, Ron's phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but he answered anyway. Ron Black, he said. Mr. Black, this is Marcus Billingham, your grandfather's lawyer, said the man on the other end of the line. Are you comfortable talking now? Yet convenient, Ron replied. How can I help you? I found out that your grandfather passed away yesterday, Marcus said. First of all, I want to express my condolences to you. He and I were friends for many years. Thank you, Mr. Billingham, Ron replied. Please call me Marcus, he said. Secondly, I would like to discuss your grandfather's will with you and your sister. Can you come to my office this morning? Well, I can come, said Ron. Now I'll ask Lisa. She's here. He hung up and looked at his sister. Can you take the day off and go to Grandpa's lawyer? I think I can, she said. We have 3 days of bereavement leave, so I don't think it will be a problem. Let me call work first. She took out her phone and called her boss, explaining the situation. She ended the call and looked at Ron. No problem, she said. I can go. Ron returned to his conversation with Marcus and put him on speakerphone. Marcus, I'm on speakerphone, Ron said. Lisa said she could come. What time should we be at your place? Can you arrive by 10 o'clock? He asked. Lisa nodded. We'll be there, Ron replied. Great, Marcus said. See you at 10 o'clock. They ended the conversation after Marcus dictated his address to them, and Lisa went to get ready. They soon went to the city center, where Marcus's office was located. Ron found a parking spot in the main downtown garage, and they walked 2 blocks to the high-rise building where Marcus' office was located. The secretary wrote down their names and showed them to Marcus's office. "Please come in," Marcus said as the secretary opened the door. He shook their hands and offered them a cup of coffee, which they gratefully accepted. Marcus invited the secretary to bring 3 cups, then invited them to sit down. "You're probably wondering why I invited you both today," he said. "Yeah, a little interesting," Ron replied, "especially since I was just about to call you about family law." "Are you planning a divorce?" asked Marcus. Ron nodded. "Yes," he replied. "Then we can solve both issues at the same time," Marcus said. "I was just drawing up a marriage contract for you and Nancy at the request of your grandfather. I hope you don't mind, but he mentioned to me shortly before his death that you might consider using our services. We'll discuss this a little later. First, I'd like to talk to you about some very important changes to your grandfather's will." "About?" Ron was surprised. "What changes?" "About 8 months ago, your grandfather basically cut your father and your brothers out of his will," Marcus said. "He left each of them $1. Your father was the original executor of his will, but he changed it. Now you, Ron, have been appointed executor of the will. All his property was placed in a trust, and you and your sister have been appointed administrators of this trust with equal powers." Ron and Lisa looked at each other, shocked. This was the first they had heard of the changes, and Mark had never mentioned that their father and brothers would be deprived of such a large portion of their inheritance. "Under normal circumstances, this would not cause much difficulty, but your grandfather's estate is quite significant," Marcus continued. "Perhaps not as big as Bill Gates, but quite significant. Even after paying my fees and all final expenses, you two will be set for life. If you want, I can handle all the issues with the probate court, but you will still have to make the final decisions. Don't worry about my fees. Your grandfather has already paid them from his property." "Do you think our father can challenge this?" asked Ron. Marcus nodded. "I'll be surprised if he doesn't," he replied. "Well, Grandpa trusted you for a long time," Ron said, "so I don't mind if you handle inheritance issues. Lisa, are you okay with this?" Lisa nodded. "Yes, of course," she replied. "Great. For your information, there are 4 properties in the trust," Marcus continued. "Your grandfather's house, the house you live in with Nancy, Ron, the house your parents currently occupy, and the lakefront property." "Wait," said Ron. "Is the house where Mom and Dad live in the trust too? I thought Grandpa had a mortgage on this house." "No," Marcus replied. "He bought out the mortgage a few years ago when your father lost his job. There is no more mortgage. He allowed your parents and brothers to live in this house for minimal rent. If you want, you can continue the same agreement with them. It's entirely up to you." "What is this area on the shore of the lake?" asked Ron. "I didn't know anything about him." "Your grandfather planned to use it as a summer vacation spot," Marcus explained. "He started construction a few months ago, but the project is not completed yet. Perhaps you and Lisa can work together to make it a family vacation spot." They discussed the terms of Mark's will for about half an hour before the conversation turned to Ron and Lisa's affairs. "Marcus," Ron began, "we need your opinion on an issue." He turned to his sister. "Do you want to tell me yourself?" Lisa nodded and told Marcus what she had already shared with her brother earlier. She was clearly uncomfortable, and Ron felt his anger rising again. Marcus listened quietly, taking notes as she spoke. When she finished, he thought for a few minutes before speaking. "Well, Lisa," he began, "in our state, there is no statute of limitations for what you described. The only obstacle may be the need to provide evidence. You said they claimed to have a video?" She nodded. "Yes, that's what they told me," she replied. Marcus nodded. "Okay," he said. "Here's what I'll do. I'll contact the DA and see what he says. Someone from his office will probably want to talk to you before taking any action. Will you be ready for this?" "Yes," she replied. "I want them to answer for what they did." "Are you saying your mother didn't know anything about this?" he asked. No, as far as I know, Lisa replied. Okay, he said. I can't promise anything, but I'll talk to the DA and let you know what he says, okay? Thank you, she replied. Marcus then turned to Ron, who pulled the flash drive out of his pocket. And you? Asked Marcus. Ron handed him the flash drive. I want a divorce, Ron said. On this flash drive, there is a video of my wife with my father and two brothers. It's pretty revealing. Marcus inserted the flash drive into his computer and started the video. His face turned red as he watched the footage. When the video ended, he pulled out the flash drive and looked at Ron. Do you mind if I keep this for a while? He asked. No, I don't mind, Ron replied. Fine. I'll also mention this to the DA if you don't mind, Marcus said. I will begin filing the divorce papers based on the prenuptial agreement and provide her with formal notice. When do you plan to talk to her about this? Tonight, when she gets home from class, Ron replied. Okay, Marcus said. I can assure you that based on this video, the case is practically won. Adultery is still grounds for divorce in our state, and it can even result in criminal prosecution, although I haven't heard of any such cases recently. As I recall, your contract states that in the event of infidelity, the guilty party leaves the marriage without any maintenance. The house you live in is actually owned by your grandfather's trust, so she has no rights to it. Does she work somewhere? No, she's a full-time student, Ron replied. I planned to rent her an apartment so that she would have a place to live until she finished her studies. I have already paid for her tuition until the end of the program. According to the agreement, she should receive $2,500 for each year of our marriage, plus the money she had at the time of the wedding. It was about $450. I'll give her a check for that amount tonight. She has her own car, so she can keep it. I understand, Marcus said. You're being quite generous, considering the circumstances. I hate what she did, but I don't want her to end up on the street, Ron said. I'm glad to hear that, Marcus said. Okay, I'll draw up the documents. I will also obtain a restraining order against her and her accomplices. Be sure to tell me her new address so I can serve her the notice. If you get any further evidence, let me know. If she does not contest the divorce, it will become final in 6 months. Thanks, Ron said. How much do I need to pay as a down payment? Don't worry about it now, Marcus said. I'll send you the bill. Besides, your grandfather has already contributed a significant amount of advance money, so I will work within that budget. Marcus handed each of them his business card, then stood up, signaling that the meeting was over. Ron and Lisa stood up as well, and all three shook hands. I'm really sorry you had to go through that, Marcus said. Your grandfather loved you two very much. He always said that he hoped for family reconciliation. If you need anything, please call at any time. I'll discuss this with the district attorney and let you know the results. I already have your contact information. Thanks, Marcus, Ron said. Their next stop was the office of Alfred Johnson, a private investigator who was hired by Mark to install cameras in the house and keep an eye on Nancy. After talking with a secretary, a gum-chewing red-haired woman with a slightly brash personality, they were shown to Alfred's office. A middle-aged man, smoking a cigar and looking like something out of a detective movie, stood up from the table and greeted them. Just call me Al, he said after all the introductions. Yes, I talked to your grandfather, and we are already following your wife. I must say, she is quite a busy lady. I haven't finished my report yet, but I have a lot of photos and video footage. What did you find out? Asked Ron. As you suspected, your wife has hosted several men in just the last 24 hours, Al said. In total, I would say there were at least 15 of them, including your father and two brothers. 15? Ron asked, stunned. The situation was getting even worse than he could have imagined. Yes, Al replied. He pulled a folder out of his desk drawer and handed it to Ron. The folder was full of photos and included a DVD. This is only for the time before we started monitoring. I can say that your father and brothers were also at your home this morning. They arrived around 8:30 and left around 10 o'clock. We have a video of this too. It's on DVD. I have to warn you, it's shocking and quite explicit. Ron quickly did the calculations. If they leave at 10 o'clock, everything should start happening around 15 o'clock. Thanks, said Ron. I think we have enough evidence for a divorce. I've already started the process, so if you want, after tonight you can consider it complete. Okay, Al said. My men will watch her tonight, and then we will stop watching her. I can provide a full report in 3 days, if that suits you. Okay, Ron replied. How much do I owe you? I'll sort this out when we're done and send you an invoice for the remaining amount, Al said. Your grandfather has already paid for a week of observation, so perhaps there will be a refund. My grandfather was shot yesterday, Ron said, so any refund can be sent to me. I'm sorry, Al said. Damn it. I treated Mark well. He helped me get started, you know. Okay, when everything is completed, I'll figure it out and get back to you, okay? Okay, Ron said, handing Al a card with contact information. We'll be in touch, Al said before they left, and let me know when you'll arrange the funeral. I would like to pay my final respects. Afterwards, Ron and Lisa went to lunch and discussed the morning's events. I knew that grandfather had a lot of money, but I didn't think that he was so wealthy, said Lisa. Me too, Ron replied. I'm still dizzy. What's next on your plan? Asked Lisa. I saw on the internet that in the complex where you live there are small furnished studios for rent, he said. I'd like to take one for Nancy. If you don't mind, of course, having her live in the same complex as you. No, I don't mind, she said. You're really doing this, aren't you? She asked after a few moments. You're really putting her out on the street. Yes, said Ron. I don't trust her anymore, and the love I felt for her has practically disappeared. You've changed, Ron, she said, strongly. The Ronnie I remember as a child would probably just give in and let her do whatever she wanted to him. And he certainly wouldn't have beaten his brother like you did yesterday. What happened to you? That Ron is gone, he said. And the times when I tolerated all sorts of rubbish from people are also gone. He realized she was more right than she knew. Old Ron would never have done what he did to Nancy. And even if he did it or even planned it, he would be tormented by guilt. New Ron, however, did not feel the slightest remorse, and he felt no guilt for what he knew would happen to his father and brothers. Moreover, old Ron would probably have curled up in a ball over the end of his marriage. He might even beg Nancy to come back and let her turn him into one of those pathetic husbands he read about on the internet. But that Ron no longer existed, replaced by something else. However, he needed to be careful, and he knew it. If pushed hard enough, he could easily turn into a modern version of Stevenson's Edward Hyde. I like this new Ron, Lisa said with a smile. He smiled back. Thank you, he said. Me too. So, what do you think about Mom? She asked. If Dad and the guys go to prison, she won't have any income. Even if they don't go to jail, there's still the issue of the house. Are you going to kick them out? It's tempting, he said. I have enough reasons to throw them out into the street. But I don't want my mom to get hurt. I don't mind her staying if they end up in jail. Let's see how things work out, okay? Okay, she said. Would you mind creating a small fund for her so that she can survive? No, I don't mind, he replied. I think Grandpa would have done the same. I think you're right, she said. After they had lunch, they returned to Lisa's apartment and headed to the office. Lisa introduced Ron to the office manager and explained the situation. So you want to rent a studio for your future ex-wife? Asked Marcia, the manager. Yes, said Ron, and I'm willing to pay 6 months in advance if possible. 6 months? Marcia was surprised. You are quite generous. Yes, we can arrange it if you need. I have one furnished studio that is currently available if that suits you. Okay, said Ron. Marcia took them to the apartment so they could look around. It was very small, but clean and included a minimal set of furniture. Considering that Nancy was constantly studying, Ron decided that this would be more than enough. I'll take it, Ron said. They returned to the office where Ron filled out all the paperwork. He signed a check for the deposit and 6 months' rent, and took the keys that Marcia gave him. "When will she move?" asked Marcia. "Tonight," Ron replied, "after she returns from school." They left the office and headed to Lisa's apartment. As they approached, she turned to him. "Are you sure about all this?" asked Lisa. "Yes," said Ron. "The sooner she leaves, the better." "I hope you're doing the right thing," she said. "It's the only thing I can do," he said. "At least I'm not forcing her to live in the car, although I was very close to that." "I understand," she said. "Do you mind if I keep in touch with her to make sure she's okay?" "I don't care," said Ron. "She'll need a job soon. Maybe you can help her." "I'll see what I can do," said Lisa. "See you soon, okay?" He nodded. Lisa hugged him. "Everything will be fine, brother. You'll see." "Thank you, Lisa," he said. "I appreciate it." He left and went to the bank, where he made changes to his accounts. He removed Nancy from their joint account, paid off and closed their joint credit card, applied for a new card in his name, and received a cashier's check for $5,450 in Nancy's name. It was quite an expensive day, but he knew it had to be done. From there, he returned home and began packing all of her clothes and toiletries, putting most of them in trash bags and placing them in the garage next to her scooter, which she sometimes used. He took down all the pictures of them together and put them in boxes along with their wedding album. As he was packing Nancy's things, his phone rang. He saw that Marcus was calling and answered. "Ron," Marcus said, "just wanted to let you know that I spoke with the district attorney and he was very interested in the cases involving you and Lisa." "Great," said Ron. "Do we need to do something?" "Not yet," Marcus said. "I think he will contact you both and arrange a meeting. Just wanted to let you know." "Thank you so much, Marcus," said Ron. They ended the call and Ron continued packing until he felt he had done enough. By then, it was almost 3 p.m., and he knew something interesting was about to start. He went down to the laboratory and checked the video from this morning. As expected, at approximately 8:30 a.m., according to the timestamp on the video, Nancy was joined in the bedroom by his father, John, and George. George had a large bruise on his face where Ron had hit him the day before. "What happened to you?" asked Nancy. "Your lethargic husband did this to me yesterday in the hospital," George said. "You never told me he did martial arts." "Sorry," she said. "I guess I forgot to tell you. He started doing this in college." "Well, that little bitch will pay dearly, I promise you," he said. "What are you going to do?" she asked. He pulled a pistol from his belt and showed it to him. "After my buddies kick his ass, I'll rip his damn head off," George said. Nancy shook her head. "No, please, you promised you wouldn't hurt him," she said. "I never promised a damn thing," he said. "Let's see if he's faster than a bullet." "You'll end up in jail," she said. "And what the hell?" George growled. "He owes me, and by God, he will pay." "What were you doing in the hospital?" she asked. "Dad got shot yesterday," Bob said. "He died after surgery." "Oh my God," Nancy said. "Ron didn't say anything about it last night. Did you set this up?" "No," said Bob. "It was just dumb luck. He got caught between two gangs in a drive-by shooting." "Dumb luck is right," John said. "Still, it works well for us. Now we will inherit a house and a significant part of the money." Ron laughed at this. "Yeah, that's right, asshole," he thought to himself. "Now, bitch, take off your clothes," George ordered. Nancy took off her clothes, and soon all four were in bed. After they finished and got dressed, Nancy turned to George. "So, when are your buddies going to pick Ron up?" she asked. "Probably tomorrow afternoon after you go to school. They're going to follow him in their van and grab him the first chance they get," George said. "We know a good place by the lake. After that, we will throw his body into the lake so that he can become fish food." "I wish you wouldn't do that," she said. "Well, it's going to happen, and there's nothing you or anyone else can do about it," John said. "Now don't get brave and all that. Don't tell a damn thing about this, do you hear? Otherwise, we'll tell the cops it was your idea." Nancy nodded her head slowly. Ron could see that she was uncomfortable with all this. They left the room and Nancy began to sob. A few minutes later, she went to the bathroom to shower and get ready for school. After the video ended, he checked his vitals and body parameters to compare them to the previous day and was glad to see that there was almost no change from the last time he checked. He decided not to give himself any more of his formula until the morning when he would probably need it. At that moment, his phone rang. It was his mother. He answered, almost knowing what she was going to say. "Ron, you need to meet me at the hospital," she said. "They're taking Daddy and the boys." "For what?" he asked. "There's something wrong with their things," she said. "Things?" asked Ron. "What things?" "You know, their manhood," she said. "Okay, give me a couple of minutes. I have an errand to run," he said. "Thanks, Ron," she said before hanging up. Ron opened the phone book and dialed the number he was looking for. "Police Department, homicide," the woman who answered said. "Yeah, I'd like to talk to someone about the murder plot," Ron said. "One moment, please," the woman said. After a minute of electronic music, a man's voice was heard on the phone. "Murder, Detective Sparks," the man said. "Detective, my name is Ron Black, and I would like to report a murder plot," Ron said. "Tell me what you know, sir," Detective Sparks said. Ron briefly outlined the situation and told him everything he had heard from his brothers. "Do you know where the criminals are now?" Detective Sparks asked when Ron had finished. "They're going to the hospital," Ron said. "For all I know, they may even be in surgery right now." "Got it," Detective Sparks said. "I'm on my way there," Ron said. "Can you or one of your officers meet me there? I asked them to videotape it, and I can provide you with a copy." "Absolutely," the detective said. "See you there." Ron hung up and laughed as he copied the incriminating videos onto the flash drive. After locking everything up, he headed to the hospital, carrying his laptop and flash drive. He found a place to park and headed to the emergency room. Once inside, he spoke to the man at the front desk and was directed to a room where 3 men were undergoing surgery. He noticed Lisa and his mother talking to a man in a cheap suit. There was a uniformed policeman with them. "Hey, Mom," Ron said, walking up to them. "How are Dad and the boys?" "It's not good," she said, crying. "They are in surgery now. The doctor said they would have to amputate them, below the waist." Said Ron. "Sorry to hear that." The suit looked at Ron. "Are you Ron Black?" he asked. Ron nodded his head. "I am," said Ron, "and you must be Detective Sparks." "Yes," he said. He pointed to a couple of chairs in the waiting area. "Do you want to talk about this?" "Of course," said Ron. His mother spoke. "What is this, Ron?" she asked. "What's happening?" "Well, Mom, since it's going to affect you, you should probably know," Ron said. He motioned for Lisa to follow them too. After they sat down, Ron pulled out his laptop and plugged in the flash drive. June and Lisa gasped when they saw Nancy with the 3 men. "Okay," said Ron, "listen to this." He played the video loud enough for Detective Sparks, his mother, and Lisa to hear what was being said. He quickly played through the sex scenes to play out the ending, but June saw enough to know what was going on. Her eyes widened as she saw 3 men grab Nancy. Ron played a role at the end where George and John laid out the plan. When it was finished, he finished the video, pulled out the disc, and handed it over to Detective Sparks. "Do you know who their accomplices might be?" Detective Sparks asked. "No, sir, I don't know," said Ron. "It could be someone from work, or someone they drink with." Sparks looked at June. "Did you know anything about this?" he asked her. June shook her head. "No, Detective, I didn't know anything," she said. "If I had known, I would have cut these things off for them myself." He smiled and nodded his head. "I understand," he said. He turned to Ron again. "Did you see any van on the way here?" he asked. "No, I didn't," Ron replied. "It's clear. So, if they are planning something, it will most likely be in the morning," the detective said. "You say your wife is at school now?" "Presumably," said Ron. "I understand," Sparks said. "I'll have to interrogate her. I don't know if the DA would want to charge her. It seems like she's not a conspirator, But even if she's involved after the fact, she's still an accomplice. Perhaps the prosecutor will offer her a deal. I don't know yet. Do what you need to do, detective, Ron said. I had already started divorce proceedings and was going to kick her out of the house today. Is it true? The detective was surprised. Do you know where she is going to live? Yes, I know, said Ron. He gave the detective the address of the studio he rented for Nancy that day. Thank you, Sparks said. I'll talk to the district attorney about this and see what he decides to do. In the meantime, I'll leave Officer Green with these three. I don't think they're going anywhere. Mrs. Black, we will also need to search your home. Please do whatever is necessary, she said. By the way, detective, said Ron, could you look for some records? What records? Asked the detective. Lisa's face turned red as Ron looked at her. Lisa, maybe you should talk to your mom alone and tell her what's going on, Ron suggested. She nodded and took her mother's arm. What's going on, Ron? Asked June. Lisa will tell you everything, Ron replied. He turned to the detective. My lawyer told me today that he spoke with the district attorney and he is interested in our case. I have reason to believe that my older sister was abused by the same three men several years ago. They claimed to have video of it and used the threat of exposure to keep her quiet. Detective Sparks closed his eyes and sighed heavily. Damn it, he cursed quietly. Okay, I'll talk to the prosecutor and see what he says. Meanwhile, I will post officers in your area. If we see a van anywhere nearby, we'll deal with it. Will you be okay alone? Everything will be fine, detective, Ron said. At that moment, they heard screams from the corridor. They looked up and saw June leaning over with her hand over her mouth. She got it, Ron thought. Well done, Lisa, he told himself. Detective Sparks looked at Ron. Take care of them, he said, and I'll take care of the other three. Ron nodded. Thank you, detective. I'll do that, Ron said. Detective Sparks spoke with Officer Green and then approached June and Lisa. After a short conversation with them, he walked out, nodding and waving at Ron. About an hour later, the doctor came out of the operating room and approached June and Lisa. Ron joined them, and they all went into one of the private chat rooms. We have completed the operation on your husband and two sons, said the doctor to June. They are now in intensive care and will be there for about an hour. They will then be transferred to wards. Just so you know, they will be able to urinate, but they will never be able to have sex again. We'll leave them here for a few days to make sure it doesn't spread further. Do you know what they might have been doing to make this happen? They had sex with my wife hours before they called 911, Ron said. The doctor looked at him and nodded. When was the last time you had sex with her? He asked. Maybe a day or two ago, Ron replied. I've never heard of sex causing anything like this, but maybe you should get tested for STDs, the doctor said. We can do it here if you want. I think that would be nice, said Ron. The nurse will tell you which rooms they will be in, the doctor said, getting ready to leave. We will contact you if any complications arise. Thank you, doctor, June said. As the doctor left the room, Ron saw a nurse approach him. He listened to their quiet conversation. He heard only fragments, but clearly heard the doctor ask, 4 more? Exactly the same as the first 3? The nurse's answer was clear. Yes, the same as those of those 3 men. They are currently undergoing surgery. Ron smiled to himself. An hour later, Ron, June, and Lisa walked into 2 adjacent rooms where Bob, George, and John now lay. When they entered the first room where George and Bob were, they saw Officer Green sitting in the corridor between the doors. They also noticed handcuffs on both men. The nurse was checking the monitors connected to them. June, George began, but she interrupted him. Shut up, you bastard, she said, shocking the nurse. I've seen a video of the 3 of you having sex with Nancy. You're damn lucky that the doctor cut off these things for you. If he hadn't done it, I would have done it for sure. And I'll make sure that all 3 of you go to jail for what you did to Ron and for what you did to Lisa, pathetic pieces of shit. And by the way, I am filing for divorce. I should have done it a long time ago. She turned to George. And you. I had to have an abortion when I was pregnant with you. You are disgusting to me. To me, all three are dead, and I never want to see you again. Mom, please, George began. It's all his fault, he added, pointing at Ron. Nonsense, she said. I saw the video. I saw you. I heard what you were planning to do to your own brother. You are no longer my son, and I hope you are executed. She turned sharply and left the room to tell John the same thing. Ron smiled as he looked at the two men in their beds. So you were going to shoot me? Well, did you succeed? He asked. Yes, so what? George growled, suffering from pain. I told you a long time ago that I would make you pay. Yes, and what will you do about it, little thing? Asked George. We're not in prison, asked George. We're not going to jail forever, asshole. Mark my words. When we get out, I'll track you and Lisa down and finish the job. I will kill you both. Shut up, George, Bob said. No, no, let him talk, said Ron. I want to hear how he plans to kill us. It will be a surprise, George hissed. You'll never see me coming, you limp asshole. Ron laughed. At least I still have something in my pants, Ron said. He looked back and saw the nurse looking at them with wide eyes. Did you hear what he said? He asked her. She nodded her head. Yes, I did it, she said, and I'll be more than happy to testify. She handed Ron a card with her name and contact information on it. Me too, said a voice at the door. Ron turned to see Officer Green at the door. The body of a large black man took up almost the entire door, and he had a frown on his face. Ron nodded his head and turned back to George, pulling the recorder out of his pocket. He pressed a couple of buttons, and they all heard George's recorded confession. Well, asshole, said Ron, 3 of us heard your confession, and I wrote it all down. I'll make sure the dog gets it. Officer Green and the nurse chuckled. Have a nice day, Ron said as he walked out the door. He entered John's room and saw that his older brother was chained to the bed, like George and Bob. He walked up to John with a smile on his face. By the way, you idiot, said Ron, your idiot brother confessed to your crimes. There were 3 witnesses, and I wrote it all down for the DAW. I just wanted you to know. Ron said nothing but turned and walked away, June and Lisa joining him. They went to the hospital cafe and sat at a table, and Ron bought them lattes. June looked like she was about to cry. What will happen to me, Ron? She asked through tears. I have no income, no job, no skills, nothing. We will lose our house and everything else. We'll get to that in a minute, Mom, Ron said. I want to know something from you first. What is this? She asked through tears. Did you ever really love me as a child? He asked. She blinked, looking at him in surprise. Of course, Ron, she said. I still believe. You are my son. You know that. No, Mom, I don't know, he said. As a child, you scolded me, constantly telling me that I should be like other boys. Of course, you never abused me, and you weren't as cold and hard as Dad and the boys, but I never remember you telling me that you loved me. When I was in college, you never even sent me a card for Christmas or my birthday. Why? I'm so sorry, Ron, she said. This is your father's doing. He was so dominant, and they were always so jealous of you. He was afraid that you would turn into a mama's boy. It only got worse after you left, and he lost his job. Has he ever insulted you? Asked Ron. Her face turned red, and she looked away in embarrassment. After a moment, she wiped a tear from her eye and answered. A few times, but I think I deserved it, she said. No, Mom, you don't deserve this, Ron said. If anyone deserves it, it's those 3 idiots up there. Did you know that your grandfather bought your house with a mortgage? He asked. She shook her head. No, I didn't do that, she said. Your father took care of all this, and I was never allowed to see any statements. I don't even know how to pay bills or write a check. He gave me cash to buy groceries, and that was it. Sometimes he would give me a few extra dollars for clothes or a haircut. Ron looked at Lisa and saw her nod her head slightly. Well, Grandpa put your house in his trust, and Dad paid a little rent every month, Ron said. That's the only reason you've never lost a house. Grandfather entrusted Lisa and me with managing the fund, so we can do whatever we want with it. I have no problem with you staying there as long as you want, and I think Lisa agrees with me. Yes, said Lisa. Ron nodded his head. We also talked about setting up a fund for you so you can take care of yourself, he said. Lisa and I can help you get back on your feet and show you how to handle your bills if you want. Hell, I'll even pay for your divorce. My grandfather's lawyer is handling mine, and I'm sure he will take care of my divorce too. And yours too. June looked at Ron, her eyes filled with tears. Would you do all this for me? She asked. Even after everything that happened? Yes, Mom, said Ron. I would. June burst into tears. Lisa hugged June, tears streaming from her eyes. Grandfather once told me something about tempering justice with a dose of mercy. June looked at him. You look a lot like your grandfather, she said. Ron smiled. Thank you, he said. I like to think so. I'm talking about my father, she said. You've never met him. He died before you were born. You even look a lot like him. I think you'd really like him. He and your father never got along. They quarreled all the time. Maybe that's why your father never liked you too much. It made sense to Ron. June looked at Ron after she had calmed down. So what are you going to do with Nancy? She asked. I've started divorce proceedings and I'm kicking her out tonight, Ron said. As long as she's not in jail. I don't blame you, she said. I'm so sorry about everything, Ron. I love you. You will always be my baby. Ron smiled at this. I love you too, Mom, he said. They got up from the table. Will you ever be able to forgive me? Asked June. Ron hugged her. Of course I forgive you, he said as she hugged him tightly for several minutes. I have to go home, June said after they broke the hug. I'm a mess. June and Lisa hugged for several minutes. After June left, Lisa looked at Ron. What you did was very nice, Ron, she said. Thank you. He looked at her again before hugging her. Any time, he said. What she said makes sense to me. I think since Dad is out of commission, I will now have to worry about organizing Grandpa's funeral. I'll help you with this, she said. Thank you, he said. I'm going to need all the help I can get. He looked at his watch. I think I better go home and get ready to meet Nancy. Okay, she said. Let me know how things go. Call if you need anything. Ron came home and changed into shorts and a t-shirt. He placed his laptop on the table along with his briefcase. He didn't expect Nancy to be home until midnight or later and was surprised to hear the garage door open around 11:30. You're home early, he said as she entered the house. It was a really bad day, she said. I just finished talking to the police. Some detective kept asking me about the plot to kill you. Interesting, said Ron. I'll go upstairs to take a shower and then go to bed, she said. No, I think not, he said. Listen, I really had a really bad day, she said. And the situation will get worse, he said. Sit down. I want to take a shower first, she said. I said, sit, Ron shouted. Right fucking now. She looked at him in shock. Slowly, she pulled out the chair opposite him and sat down. I have something I want you to watch, he said, showing a video of her having sex with his father and brothers. Her eyes widened as she watched the video. Oh God, no, please, she sobbed. Look, he said. All of this. There's more, including a video of you four plotting to kill me. Please, Ron, I didn't mean to do this, she said. Bullshit, bitch, he said. You slept with them the day we got married. Don't deny it. I was naive then, but not anymore. How often have you done this to them? I don't know, she said. Most weekdays after you leave for work. All the time we were married? He asked. Most of last year, she said. But I didn't want to hurt you. They told me that they have my video and they will give it to you if I don't have sex with them. Video of what? He asked. Video of what happened on our wedding day, she said as tears rolled down her cheeks. What about all the other men you've had? He asked. She looked up in shock. And at my last company meeting, How many men have you brought into bed since we got married? She looked down, ashamed. I don't know, she said. A few, maybe. Some? Asked Ron. What, are we talking about 5, 10, 50, a couple hundred? God, no, she said. Well, I have a video that shows at least 12 men came to the school in just one day, he said. What, you think I'm paying for your tuition so you can have every guy on campus? I'm not stupid, Nancy. If you count your 3 morning friends, that's 15 men in one day. Do the math, it's 75 at school, plus me and whoever else you decide to take along the way. I'm really sorry, she said. I just needed it to get through my classes. It's just sex. I never took anything from you. Just sex? Never took anything away from me? Asked Ron. Are you fucking kidding me right now? I also noticed that you never used any protection. Were you trying to catch a disease so you could bring it home to me or something? What the hell is wrong with you? Her tears dried up and her behavior changed significantly. Now she looked angry. Okay, she said defiantly. I admit it. I like having sex. Understood. You're a stupid bitch, Ron said. At this, her eyes widened. Yes, I may have once been naive and a little weak, but Ron is gone, and he will never return. Trust me on this shit, asshole. Did the police tell you about my father and brothers? No, they didn't, she said. This is the key to your new apartment. Address on the tag. You get out of here, he said. He placed the cash receipt on the table. This is what you are owed under the marriage contract. Spend wisely. You'll probably have to look for a job soon. Your tuition has already been paid, and my lawyer knows your new address. You can keep your car and scooter. The phone will be turned off at the end of the month. Don't try to fight a divorce, or you might end up being the next internet celebrity. You wouldn't dare, she exclaimed. Why not? He asked. You said to yourself that you like to have sex. You are addicted to sex. Maybe, if you're lucky, you can make money from it. He grabbed her hand and tore off her wedding and engagement rings. Taking her bag, he removed her house keys and pulled out bank cards from her wallet. He then gave her the bag back. Now get out of my house, bitch, he said. She stepped back, shocked. She had never heard him talk to her like that. She always thought that he would just obey her. Please, she said, shedding a tear. I didn't want all this. I'm sorry. I won't do this again. I really love you. He laughed in her face. What, you think this is one of those stupid internet stories about men who get high when their wives have sex with other men? Do you think I'm dumb enough to believe this shit? He asked. Fuck you. Oh wait, it seems like everyone in this town has already done it. By the way, why aren't you in prison yet? The prosecutor offered me immunity if I testified against your father and brothers, she said. Sorry, Ron. Maybe we can at least remain friends. I really didn't mean to hurt you. Friends? Do you think I want to be friends with someone who lied to me and planned to kill me? He asked. I was just your ticket to bread and butter. My God, you're even dumber than I thought. Now I hate you, and I never want to see your stupid face again. Understood? Or should I draw you a picture in colored pencils? No, I understand, she said quietly. Can I at least come to your grandfather's funeral? As long as you stay away from me, he said. Now put your trash in the car and get out of here. Now. She turned around and walked towards the door, heading into the garage. He could hear her struggling to pack everything into the car. When she left, he went out and changed the code on the garage door so she couldn't come back. After he locked the house, he went to his laboratory. Early in the morning, he heard the doorbell ring. He went downstairs in a robe and looked through the peephole, seeing 3 men in dark suits. He opened the door, and they all showed their IDs. Dr. Black asked one of them. With 2 doctorates, Ron was entitled to this title, but rarely used it and preferred to be called by his first name. Yes, Ron answered. Gordon Sullivan, CDC. I'm here to talk to your wife, Nancy. Is she here? He asked. Ron shook his head. No, she doesn't live here anymore, he said. What's the matter? We need to talk to her alone, Ryan said. Like I said, she doesn't live here anymore. Ron repeated. Do you want her address? Yes, we do, Gordon replied. Ron gave them the address of her apartment and watched them leave. He was relieved that they didn't want to search his house, but thought they might come back. He looked in both directions, trying to spot a van that might belong to his brother's accomplices, but saw nothing. He turned on the TV and made himself a cup of coffee. When he returned to the room, the local news began. In an emergency report, local medical authorities say that about 40 men have had to undergo emergency surgery to remove male organs in the last 18 hours, the announcer said. It was a long night at the medical center. Due to the nature of this outbreak, we were forced to contact the CDC, the doctor said. We're not sure how widely it has spread, and we're very concerned. The scene changed back to the announcer. Investigators say about 30 men admitted to having sex with the same woman. She is being sought by medical authorities at the time of publication of this report. Due to confidentiality rules, the names of the participants are not disclosed, the announcer said. Ron laughed. 40 men, right? This bitch was busy, that's for sure. He wondered how many of them were married. Soon they won't be, he thought. A few minutes later, the phone rang. It was Lisa. Good morning, she said when he answered. Did you see the news? Yes, I did, said Ron. 40 men? I'm sure it created a lot of noise. Lisa laughed. It probably did, she said. Well, the CDC came here this morning and looked for her. She was named by several men who ended up in the hospital. I gave them the address of her new apartment, he said. They will find her, Lisa said. Her admission to the hospital should set off alarm bells if the CDC is involved. I'll keep you posted. Thanks, Ron said. After he finished the conversation, he burst out laughing. He, of course, did not expect such a development of events, but he was pleased that she would feel the heat in every sense of the word from her own actions. However, he was a little worried that he had overlooked it when he was creating the formula and wondered if the potion he was using on himself had clouded his thinking. Usually, he did not miss such details. Perhaps it was anger and shock at the situation, he thought. He looked out the window and noticed a blue Ford van parked in front of his house. There were police cars around, and he saw the police leading 3 very large men in handcuffs to the cars. One was black, one was white, and the third looked Hispanic. He didn't recognize any of them. After the men were placed in 2 cars, one of the officers walked to his front door and rang the bell. Good morning, officer, Ron said as he opened the door. How can I help? Good morning, Mr. Black, the officer said. Detective Sparks asked me to notify you when the suspects are apprehended. We'll be increasing patrols in your area over the next day or two to make sure you're okay. Thank you, officer, Ron said. I appreciate it. I have a recording that might be of interest to Detective Sparks. Can I give it to him today? I think so, the officer said. He's really busy right now, so maybe you should call him first so he can wait for you. I'll do that, thanks, Ron said. Have a good day, sir, the officer said before leaving. Ron closed the door, relieved that they had caught the 3 men. He dressed and walked to the wagon, where another officer was keeping records of the evidence. 2 cars with suspects have already left. Good morning, sir, the officer said as Ron approached. Are you Mr. Black? Yes, said Ron. I can't tell you how glad I am that you caught these guys. I can imagine how you feel, the officer said. What did you find here? Asked Ron. He saw the gun and some other items already packed in marked plastic bags. Well, I found a lot of sexual paraphernalia, the officer said. I think we have a good basis for bringing charges, Detective Sparks said. I am going to interrogate the 3 suspects who were detained this morning. We have pretty strong evidence against them. It turns out that they are recidivists, and this is their 3rd case. By the way, the Sex Crimes Investigation Unit is also looking into your sister's case. They found the video you mentioned, and this is irrefutable evidence. As far as I understand, it's obvious that she was under the influence of something. Wow, Ron said. Yes, wow is an understatement, said Detective Sparks. The prosecutor is thirsty for blood in this case. So, in addition to everything else, your father and brothers will be put on the list of registered sex offenders. The rest of the day passed in a blur as Ron busied himself with the preparations for Mark's funeral. The ceremony was to take place in a couple of days, and as he learned, his grandfather had the foresight to pay in advance all the expenses associated with the funeral and the cemetery plot that was next to his grandmother's burial place. The headstone was already in place, but the date of Mark's death needed to be added. He contacted the cemetery and made the necessary. arrangements. He also found Mark's old military ID, DD-214, which implied that he was a decorated Vietnam War veteran. He contacted the Department of Veterans Affairs and, after going through several instances, was able to organize a burial ceremony with a guard of honor. The flag had already been ordered, and Ron learned that his grandfather had asked to be given to him. When he found out about this, his eyes filled with tears. The funeral home staff were very helpful, informing Ron that all arrangements had already been made. One of their employees even wrote a very good obituary and included the names of Mark's descendants after receiving information from Ron. "Your grandfather was a very respected man in our community, Mr. Black," said the funeral home director. "I wouldn't be surprised if there are a lot of famous people at the ceremony." With that, Ron returned home and relaxed as he told Lisa about what he had done. He ended up in his lab, checking his vital signs and body weight. The results pleased him. Perhaps he had finally found the right formula. He decided not to take another dose of the potion that evening and instead changed into his sportswear. He found that physical activity became a kind of catharsis for him and helped him think clearly. Mark's funeral took place a couple of days later and went well. As the funeral home director had said, several famous people attended the ceremony, including a former United States Senator and several members of the House of Representatives. They all shook Ron's hand and expressed their condolences. Ron gave a moving speech and thanked everyone who came. Then they went to the cemetery for a funeral service. He thought he was the last one left and sat down at Mark's grave. Overcome with grief, he began to sob. Mark was more than just a grandfather to him. He was Ron's best friend and confidante. Mark always supported him, even when no one else did. He felt a hand on his shoulder and looked up to see Lisa with tears streaming down her face. "I miss him too," she said. He nodded. "For a long time, he was my only real family," Ron said. "Sometimes I wonder what I'll do without him." "I know, Ron," she said quietly. "But he'll never really go away, you know. As long as you remember him, he will always be in your heart. And I promise that I will always be by your side." "Thank you, Lisa," Ron said. "It means a lot to me." He spent time with her and held her while she mourned Mark, but he was so busy with the ceremony that he couldn't spend as much time with her and Lisa as he would have liked. "She's sad, but I think she can handle it," Lisa said. "Marcus is filing papers against Dad, and he will either be served with them in the hospital or in prison. They plan to arrest all three in the next few days." Ron laughed when he heard the news. "Nancy said she wanted to be here, but I didn't see her," he said. "Well, she's recovering, but the CDC is keeping her in isolation," Lisa said. "They are not allowing her to have contact with anyone at the moment." "It's probably a wise decision," Ron said. He looked at his watch. "I really have to go," he said. "I would like to have a good night's sleep. The last few days have exhausted me." "Okay," she said. "Don't get lost. I would like to invite you and Mom to dinner this weekend, if possible." "That sounds good," he said before they left. As they walked to their cars, Detective Sparks approached them. "I just wanted to express my condolences and tell you about your business," he said, shaking Ron's hand. "Thank you, Detective," Ron said. "What news?" "Well, the three suspects we apprehended are singing like canaries," Detective Sparks said. "It turns out this is their third time, and it could put them away for life. The weapons they had turned out to be stolen." "So this matter has already been decided?" asked Ron. "Pretty much," Sparks said. "And that recording of their confession puts an end to that. The next day at work, his boss approached him. "Ron, there's a person here from the CDC who wants to talk to you," he said. "He's waiting for you in conference room 3. "Thanks," Ron said. He cleaned himself up and followed his boss out of the laboratory. "Can you tell me what this is about?" asked the boss. "Not now," said Ron. "I'll explain later." "Okay," the boss said. "Just don't delay the explanation." "I won't," Ron promised. Gordon stood up as Ron entered the conference room. "Dr. Black," Gordon said. "Good to see you again." "Please, call me Ron," Ron said, shaking Gordon's hand. "What brings you here?" "I wanted to discuss your wife's case with you," he said. "I hope you don't mind, but I've taken the liberty of checking your biography." "So what?" asked Ron. "I know everything about you," Gordon said. "A verified 215 IQ, a member of Mensa, 2 PhDs from MIT, a self-made multimillionaire. Quite is impressive for a young person like you. Colleagues appreciate you. I heard that you have a laboratory at home. Some people work on cars, some people do man caves," Ron said. "And I like to do my own research, mostly theoretical. Everything meets OSHA safety standards and requirements. What does this have to do with my wife's case?" "Well, she's in isolation right now," Gordon said. "She is recovering from operations, and we have started running tests on her. So far, nothing has been found that could explain what happened. I would like to see if you can help shed some light on this matter." Ron shook his head. "I don't see how I can help you," he told Gordon. "Our primary concern, of course, is public safety," Gordon said. "If we can understand what happened to your wife, perhaps we can prevent this from happening again." "I understand," said Ron. "Maybe you'd be better off spending our tax money on SAS warning about the dangers of infidelity and unprotected sex." Gordon chuckled. "Perhaps you are right," he said. "It might be something we'll look into. I'm worried about what might happen if this whatever it is spreads. Every man in America could be in danger." Ron nodded. "I see your point," Ron said. "How many more cases have been reported?" "None yet," Gordon said. "But that doesn't mean anything." "And how long do you plan to keep her in isolation?" asked Ron. "As long as it takes," Gordon said. "We need to find out what happened, and we can't risk another outbreak. My bosses agree. We have filed papers with the court to hold her as long as necessary." "It could take months," Ron said. "Or years," Gordon replied. Ron smiled to himself. The thought of Nancy being isolated for years without physical contact with her lovers seemed pleasant to him. "So what do you want from me?" asked Ron. "As I said," Gordon began, "the initial testing showed nothing. Of course, we will conduct additional tests." "Of course," said Ron. "Could you take a look at our results?" Gordon asked. "Maybe you can point us in the right direction." "Do you want me to work as a consultant?" asked Ron. "Is that the point?" "Something like that," Gordon said. "We've never seen anything like this before." "I'm sure," said Ron. "You understand that I already have a job, and I'm quite busy at the moment. You will have to coordinate this with my superiors." "Already done," Gordon said, taking an envelope from his pocket. He handed it to Ron, who looked at the letter inside, signed by the CEO. According to the letter, Ron was authorized and assigned to advise the CDC on a part-time basis for a maximum of 3 months. The letter also stated that he would be compensated by the company and the government for his cooperation. "So I guess it's already decided," Ron said, looking at Gordon. He began to suspect that Gordon suspected something and was trying to set him up. "Yes, that's true," Gordon said. "Okay," said Ron, "but I have a couple of questions." "Sure, ask," Gordon said. "First of all, you know I'm divorcing Nancy, right? Wouldn't this be considered a conflict of interest?" asked Ron. "Perhaps," Gordon said, "but I know that you are professional enough to prevent this, right?" "I guess," said Ron. "Secondly, you know that I am not qualified to make medical opinions. I'm not a medical doctor. Hell, I'm not even certified to draw blood, even though I know how to do it." "I know," Gordon said, but you're the best at analyzing test results, I'm told, and you will have minimal contact with the patient. Great, said Ron. Okay, I'll do it. But remember, this is only on a part-time basis and only for 3 months. After that, you're on your own. I understand, Gordon said. So, I'll see you tomorrow afternoon. Yes, said Ron. I want to see the full test results, blood chemistry, urine analysis, DNA, everything. Do you understand? We can start this afternoon, Gordon said. DNA may take a day or two, but we will make it a priority. I can't express how much we appreciate your help. Like you, Gordon, I don't want this to happen again, Ron said. They shook hands and Ron watched Gordon leave the room. Although he was concerned that Gordon might be trying to bait him, he wanted to find out for himself if his solution had caused any lasting damage to Nancy, and this was the best way to find out. Theoretically, this shouldn't have happened, but he had no other way to be sure. He found his boss, showed him the letter, and told him what happened. Well, said his boss, it's only for 3 months, and at the very least, it will improve the company's image in the eyes of the CDC. Keep me posted and try not to let this interfere with other projects. I will, boss, said Ron. That night, he sat in his laboratory, turning over in his head the formula he had used on Nancy. Nothing was written down on paper, so he relied on his photographic memory. As far as he could determine, there should be no side effects from the solution. The next afternoon, he was dressed in a special sealed suit designed to prevent direct contact with Nancy. After putting it on, Gordon escorted him to her room. Ron looked at her and noticed the bandages on her face. She didn't recognize him at first, but her eyes widened when she realized who it was in the suit. Mrs. Black, Gordon began. We brought in a consultant to help us understand what happened. Please cooperate with him fully. Ron, she asked weakly. Her soon-to-be ex-husband looked at her through the visor of his suit. Call me Dr. Black, he told her in a dry tone. I'm so sorry for everything, she said. I'm not here for an apology, he said. You made your position clear last night, and you got my answer. I'm here to help the CDC try to understand what you did to all these men. He looked at Gordon. Has she been tested for STDs yet? He asked. Yes, said Gordon. She was diagnosed with gonorrhea and chlamydia. We won't know about HIV for some time. She was prescribed medication before surgery. Got it, Ron said. And you have the results I asked for. Everything except the DNA, Gordon said. It should be ready in a couple of days. I sped up the process. Okay, said Ron. You know, these STDs will affect the test results. We'll have to do another full analysis in a couple of weeks or so. He looked at Nancy and handed her a thick notebook and pen. I need you to make a list of all the men you've had sex with in the last year, he told her. I know you may not know everyone, but try to write down as many as you can. Indicate those with whom you have been several times. If you do not know their names, write down the number of unknown men and provide as much detail as possible. We also need to know if you have ever taken any medications. Write this down too. In general, we need a complete diary of your actions, or as complete as possible. Is this necessary? She asked. Yes, he said. The sooner you start, the better. She nodded. When can I go home? She asked. I don't know, Ron told her. The CDC is concerned that what you have could spread. In short, you may be the latest Typhoid Mary, suffering something that puts everyone else at risk. Oh my God, she said. What have I done? He smiled. Well, in addition to ruining our marriage and my love, 40 men lost the ability to ever have sex again, Ron said. I'm sorry, she said as tears began to form in her eyes. You already said that, Ron told her. He turned to Gordon. I need to take these test results to my laboratory for analysis. I'll let you know what I find as soon as possible. Wait, are you going to take them with you? Gordon asked. Of course, said Ron. I can't analyze them here. But we have protocols, Gordon began. I have mine, Ron told him firmly. Look, you wanted my help, right? It was you who came to me, remember? If you want my help, You'll have to forget about your protocols for a while and let me do my job. If not, tell me now and I will let my superiors know that this agreement has been terminated." "Okay, Ron," Gordon said. "I think in this situation we can bend the rules a little. Let me know what you find as soon as possible, okay?" "I'll do that," said Ron. He took the folder and headed home. After eating, he went to his laboratory and began studying the test results, entering them into the computer. He studied them carefully and was not pleased with what he saw. It didn't seem like any of this could be caused by his solution, but there was something else that was bothering him. He needed more information, so he took out his phone and called Gordon. "Quickly," said Gordon. "I'm not done yet," Ron said. "I need you to do a pap smear, and quickly. Can you do this?" "Of course, Ron," Gordon said. "What's happening?" "I'm not sure yet, but I need it done immediately," Ron said. "It will be done," Gordon said. "I'll do it right now." "Okay," said Ron. "Text me when it's ready." 2 hours later, he received a message from Gordon that the samples were ready for him. He responded by text, closed the lab, and left. "Here you go," Gordon said, handing him a plastic container with samples. "What did you find?" "I'm not sure yet," Ron said. "I'll let you know." He returned to his laboratory and began the analysis. After a few hours, he sat back and double-checked his findings. If he was right, he was looking at a super gonorrhea that had never been discovered before, and no drug could cure it. The worst part was that, if he was right, it wouldn't require sexual contact to spread it. He had heard of a case where a man had caught something similar in Southeast Asia and wondered if one of Nancy's lovers was in that region. A couple of weeks later, he approached Gordon and showed him his results. "Are you sure about this?" Gordon asked. "Absolutely," Ron replied. Gordon shook his head. "So what do you suggest we do?" Gordon asked. "We'll have to develop a cure for this, but like I said, it could take a few years based on what I've found," Ron said. "I spoke with my colleagues in the laboratory, and they all agreed with my assessment. There is also something else. I found evidence of precancerous cells in the biopsies you took. If my calculations are correct, and they almost always are, Nancy may develop cervical cancer in the next couple of years." "Do you think this new bacteria caused the outbreak?" Gordon asked. "Honestly, I don't know," Ron said. "Possibly, since she seems to live off her tissue." "What do you propose to do?" Gordon asked. "In my opinion, she should be kept in isolation," Ron said. "At least until we can develop something to treat STDs." "I agree," Gordon said. "Let me notify my superiors and start the process. Do you want to tell her the news?" "Of course," said Ron. "I'll tell her now. There's no point in postponing." He put on his suit and entered her room. She looked at him as he sat down next to her. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Terrible," she replied weakly. "My throat hurts, it hurts to write, and something comes out of me. What's wrong with me?" "You've caught a form of gonorrhea we've never seen before," Ron said. "It looks like she's mutated. We can slow its growth, but there is no cure at this time. Even worse, it doesn't require sexual contact to spread." "Oh my God," she said, crying. "What have I done?" "You slept with the wrong men," he said calmly. "Do you know if any of the men you were with were from Southeast Asia or had been there recently?" She shook her head. "No, I didn't really question them before I slept with them," she said. "What will happen now?" "Well," said Ron, "it looks like you will remain in isolation until we can find a cure." "How long will that take?" she asked. He shrugged. "Nobody knows," he said. "It could take years." "Years?" she exclaimed. "I can't do this. I have school and work to do." "I guess your studying days are over," Ron said. She shook her head. "No, I can't do that," she said. "And that's not all," said Ron. "More? Great," she replied sarcastically. "What else?" "If I'm right, and you know I'm almost always right, you'll develop cervical cancer within a few years," he said. She began to sob. "Then just kill me now and be done with it," she said. "You know I can't do this," he said. "But I wish I could," he thought to himself. She looked at him with pleading eyes. "You must, please," she begged. "I can't stand it, not being able to touch anyone. I'm just lying here and watching TV. They won't let me touch anything unless I'm wearing latex gloves." "No," he said. "No matter how much you hurt me, Nancy, I can't do this. I can't promise that you will ever get well again, but I can promise that we will work to find a cure for this. It may take 10 years, but we will find him." "What should I do at this time?" she asked. By this time, Gordon had already appeared at the door, dressed in his protective suit. "You will be in comfortable conditions in a secure facility where you will be properly cared for," he said. "This is the only thing we can do. Now that we know what's going on, we can keep a close eye on you. And if, as Dr. Black says, you do develop cancer, we can catch it early and treat it." "What about my things?" she asked. "You'll be living in something like a studio apartment with all the amenities," Gordon said. "Of course, you still won't be allowed to have guests, but it's much more comfortable than here. We can deliver your items there if you wish. Of course, you won't need a car or anything like that, and the clothes will be provided for you." And, Ron added, "I know the remaining classes can be taken online. You may have to retake some of them due to missed time. I can arrange it if you want." "Please do it," she said, "if it's not too difficult." "It's no problem," Ron said. She looked at him with tears in her eyes. By this point, Gordon had already left the room so they could talk in private. "Sorry," she said. He nodded. "I know," Ron said. "Will I ever be able to lead a normal life again?" she asked. "I don't know," said Ron. "Perhaps, perhaps not. All you can do is live one day at a time. If it's any consolation, I'm not sure I'll ever have what you'd call a normal life again. It happens. If you had just stayed true to me, you wouldn't be in this situation." "I know," she said. "So tell me why," he asked. "Why did you cheat on me on our wedding day? Why did you keep cheating?" "Your father and brothers were very persistent," she said. "I loved how they just dominated and took me on. They bullied you constantly, and part of me got a kick out of it too. Later, they came to me and said that they have photos and videos, and they will show them to you if I don't do what they want. At first, I hated it, but as time went on, I started to like it more and more. It became something of a game. Then I realized I needed it more and started doing it with guys from school during breaks. You know the rest." "Did you mean everything you said that last night?" he asked. "Then yes," she said. "I didn't really mean any of that. I just wanted to hit you then. I'm sorry." "You already said it," Ron told her. "Does this mean that you are going through with the divorce?" she asked. "Oh yes, of course," he replied. She nodded. "I understand," she said. "Will I ever see you again?" "I doubt it," he said, standing up. "I will take care of your things and activities. I'll keep an eye on your progress, but don't expect to see or hear from me again. Goodbye, Nancy. I loved you once. It's a shame you ruined everything." "Goodbye, Ron, or rather Dr. Black," she said. He smiled and left the room. Gordon met him outside. "Are you okay, Ron?" he asked. "Yeah, I'm fine," Ron said. "I'll let you know when it's arranged," Gordon said. "I understand that your company will be leading the development of a treatment for this. I also heard that you will be doing this. Good luck." "Thanks," Ron said as he walked away. As he drove home, he thought about what had just happened. The divorce moved quickly through the system, especially after the judge learned that Nancy was the same woman whose infidelity led to the amputation of organs from 40 men. The criminal cases against Bob, George, and John dragged on through the court system, but they were eventually found guilty on all counts, and each received sentences ranging from 35 years to life in prison. June's divorce also went through and was finalized by the time Bob entered prison. Ron and Lisa set up a trust fund for her and taught her how to manage her finances. 6 months after her divorce was finalized, Lisa introduced her to a single doctor who was a couple of years older than her, and they began dating. A year later, they got married. "Take care of my mother," Ron warned him with a smile at the wedding. "Oh, I will," he said. "I promise you this." Due to the enormous size of Mark's fortune, the probate process took almost a year, but when it was completed, both Ron and Lisa found themselves with a huge amount of money. They hadn't yet decided what to do with all the property, but they had agreed to sell the house they grew up in after their mother got married. Lisa finally married Mr. Wright, who turned out to be a nurse at the hospital where she worked. Ron walked her down the aisle. At his insistence, she and her new husband moved into Mark's old house. Ron continued to work with his personal formula and declared it ready for use about 6 months after his divorce from Nancy. He went through all the legal hoops to make sure the company couldn't make any profits and began looking for suitable clients. He was still afraid to make it available to the general public, but he found a company that ran a special camp for men in northern Idaho. After much discussion with the owners, he inspected the camp and observed its operation. He was sold when he saw the burning of the bitch ceremony, in which an unfaithful wife was burned in effigy. He signed an exclusive contract with the company in hopes that his formula would help men who were once like him. He never saw Nancy again, but was regularly updated on her condition. She continued her classes online and finally completed her studies after 18 months. She wrote to Ron several times, but stopped after he refused to respond. As predicted, she developed cervical cancer just 2 years after his evaluation. She had to undergo a radical hysterectomy, followed by chemotherapy and radiation treatment. She nearly died a couple of times during treatment, but was officially declared a cancer survivor just over a year and a half after her initial diagnosis. A shadow of herself, she struggled day by day, but slowly gained strength. She continued to receive treatment for the mutated gonorrhea, but most of it seemed to have been destroyed by surgery and radiation. 2 years after treating her cancer, a formula was found to treat a new strain of gonorrhea. A year later, it was approved for use by the FDA. A year after his divorce from Nancy, Ron attended a Star Trek convention in his city. He decided to dress up as a Klingon just for fun. There, he met a charming red-haired woman named Belinda, who was also dressed as a Klingon. "Nakne," she told him, greeting him in Klingon, which translates to, "What do you want?" He was immediately impressed and began speaking to her in the language until he got to the point where she couldn't keep up with him. They spent the rest of the convention together and started dating. They spent the rest of the conference together and began dating. It turned out that she had recently divorced a violent cheater who had previously abused her. Like him, she also had a genius level of intelligence and was a member of Mensa. She also worked as a researcher, but for an aerospace company. She said that she is now looking for a man who has not only brains, but also some brawn. He told her his story and said that he was looking for an intelligent woman who knew how to be faithful. "Not only do I know how to be faithful, but I will cut you some slack if you ever cheat on me," she said with a smile. He smiled back. They spent many evenings together playing puzzles and talking in Klingon. Ron was happier than he had ever been with Nancy, and they fell in love. He proposed to her one evening and was surprised when she not only accepted, but demanded that he make her his woman right that night. After Ron kissed his new wife at their wedding, they looked into each other's eyes, raised a fist in the air, and surprised the guests when they announced in unison, "Kapla, success." Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think, click to the next one.